Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Leeds Central, who I suspect is going to have a key part in scrutinising on behalf of this House the negotiations with the EU over the course of the next few months, years and decades. Mr Deputy Speaker, I've managed to avoid debating the European Union, which is a customary habit for many members of my party for a number of years. I've managed to avoid that, obviously, by becoming a minister, although I was the EU Budget Minister when I enjoyed scrutiny by the Honourable Member for Stone as Chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee. Mr Deputy Speaker, let me make it very clear, as Honourable Members on all sides have already done, that I, as somebody who wanted us to remain a member of the European Union, accepts the results of the 23rd of June. And that's why I think the government amendment that has been put down is something that can be supported by all those that have spoken so far. But it is true to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that once the Article 50 negotiations have been completed, we will have a wholly different relationship with EU member states from outside the European Union. And that's why I also want to support the Labour motion today, because it recognises that leaving the EU is the defining issue facing the United Kingdom. And it was the Honourable Member for Doncaster North who said that the decisions that we take over the next few months and years in this Parliament will shape this country for decades and generations to come. And that is a responsibility that I think we all need to take very seriously, and to do it, as the Shadow Secretary of State said, without point scoring and without partisanship. Now, the key question clearly is going to be about access to the single market, balancing it with the issues around freedom of movement and immigration control. And I was struck that when the Secretary of State made his statement to Parliament on the 5th of September, I made the point to him then that the words single market were nowhere in his original statement to Parliament. That clearly is not going to be tenable. It's right to say that that relationship between the single market and freedom of movement was not on the ballot paper, and that's what we will be discussing in this House for months to come. But it is right to say, as I've already said to the Honourable Member for Stone, that in the Conservative Party 2015 manifesto, it is clear. We are clear about what we want from Europe. We say, and that is all those members of Parliament who were elected on the Conservative Party manifesto in 2015, we say yes to the single market. And the Prime Minister, in her speech to the Conservative Party conference, said very clearly, we want to give British companies the maximum freedom to trade with and operate in the single market. So for anyone to say that the single market is not going to be a part of the discussions, and just because we are repealing the 1972 Act we're not going to be discussing it, is not correct. I will.
Does she accept that it is impossible for us, on the one hand, to repeal the 1972 Act, which is the end game, and to remain subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court within the single market? We trade into the single market, but we are not in the single market. That's the point.
Well, let me thank the honourable gentleman very much indeed. But the point is that the European Communities Act was passed way before the single market was actually envisaged by, as we've heard, one of our former Prime Ministers. And yes, as somebody who was engaged in commercial negotiations for 16 years before I reached this House, I think anything is possible in a negotiation, as the former Deputy Prime Minister said. Mr Speaker, in the time available, I want to make three very quick points. I want to pick up on the point made by the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, in which he said, and I was pretty concerned to hear this last week in an interview given by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, that the Cabinet had not been consulted on the timing of the triggering of Article 50. that in fact it was clearly chosen by a small group of people as something to be announced at my party's party conference. The Cabinet must be, we were arguing today, Parliament must be involved in scrutinised decisions, but the Cabinet must be kept fully informed of key decisions around our leaving the European Union. The second point is, as we've heard from the Honourable Member for Leeds Central, about the status of EU citizens. Mr Deputy Speaker, I was heartbroken to receive an email from a constituent, and this is not the only one that I suspect I will receive and that many of us will receive, but a constituent who has moved here from elsewhere in the EU, who has gone through a very difficult court case about custody of her children and has settled now here in the United Kingdom. There are restrictions on where those children can travel, and that's within the EU. And she says to me, yet as EU citizens, it is becoming increasingly clear that it will become near to impossible for us to continue living in the United Kingdom. I, for one, will have great difficulty in finding employment, and she has a PhD, she's gained here, and use my expertise because I am not British. That is not the country that I want to see. I don't think that's the country that this government or this Parliament wants to see. That is not the message that we want to give out about this country, which has been built on the skills of those who have come here for generations. And I suspect many of us sitting here are here because our forefathers moved to this country and took advantage of the safety that we provide. Mr Deputy Speaker, let me say one final remark. Those who are asking questions about the scrutiny by this Parliament of these fundamental negotiations are not trying to thwart the will of the people. I resent that implication. I resent it from newspapers, I resent it from ministers, and I resent it from the briefers and spinners from the centre of this government. That only encourages me to ask more questions, and I will work with colleagues on this side of the House and colleagues across the House to ask those questions. It is Parliament's duty to scrutinise the executive. I have been at that dispatch box. I have been scrutinised by Parliament, and rightly so. And now I am here on the backbenches, I will scrutinise the executive. Our constituents send us here as members of Parliament to ask those questions that they cannot ask ministers themselves. We must, colleagues, take every opportunity to ask those questions to get the best possible deal for this country as we leave the European Union. Thank you.
Emma Reynolds.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady. She gave a very, very powerful speech, and I agree with everything she said, actually. And I wanted to reiterate something she said right at the end and the start of her speech, which is, like her, I campaign to remain in the European Union, but like her, I accept the result of the referendum. And although the Prime Minister and her ministers have spent the last few months parroting the mantra, Brexit means Brexit, this tautology is simply meaningless. People voted leave for many different reasons, and Brexit could take many different forms. I am clear that a majority of my constituents voted leave for a variety of reasons, but they didn't vote leave to become poorer. They didn't vote leave for their wages to drop, and they didn't vote leave to lose their job. And I would urge the government to bear this in mind in everything that they do. Mr Deputy Speaker, members on all sides of this House from all different corners of our country now have a hugely important job to do. Our job isn't to rerun the referendum, nor is it to block our exit of the EU. It is to hold the government to account. It is to make sure the government secures the best possible deal for the country and our constituents. I will give way.
I think my honourable friend makes a very important point, but she, like me, represents a Midlands constituency. Therefore, she, like me, will want some answers to the question about what the government's future relationship is going to be with the single market, bearing in mind that the previous Conservative government took us in there, but more importantly, companies like Jaguar Land Rover and Nissan up north will want to know in terms of future investment, because Jaguar Land Rover has invested a lot of money in the Midlands for a start. Years ago, Nissan was going to invest in Coventry but couldn't get regional aid. That's why we went into the single market.
I agree entirely with my honourable friend. Jaguar Land Rover is a very important company in my own constituency as well, and they want clarity from this government. The Brexit minister came to the House today and said that he'd made several statements, that he'd been to several select committees, but he said almost entirely nothing in that time. So we do need clarity, and we do need proper parliamentary scrutiny. That does not mean seeking to thwart the will of the people, as the Right Honourable Lady so powerfully said in her intervention. Now, I'm going to focus in my intervention on 3 tests that I want to put to the government. The first is, are they being driven by the national interest or their own party's interest? And so far, regrettably, their record is not good. Was it purely a coincidence that the Prime Minister's announcement that we would invoke Article 50 by the end of March 2017 happened to be on the first day of the Conservative Party conference? Again, was it just a coincidence that she wanted to reassure her party faithful that herself as a lukewarm Remainer actually thought that we should leave the EU? Equally, it seems that the party interest of the Conservatives was uppermost in the Prime Minister's mind when she made the claim that there is, and I quote, "there is no such thing as a choice between soft Brexit and hard Brexit," because she knows her party is divided on this issue. And again, this is not only bizarre, but it's wrong. If there was no such distinction, why did the pound slump to a 31-year low days after the Tory party conference due to fears of a hard Brexit? If there is no such distinction, why has the Treasury said that a hard Brexit could cost £66 billion a year in lost revenue, and that the economy will be between 5 to 9% smaller than if we had stayed in the single market? If there is no such distinction, why has Nissan said that there will be no further investment in their plants in the United Kingdom if the company doesn't know whether in the future they will face tariffs on their exports to the rest of the EU? It seems clear to me that some Tory members, and we've heard it already today, are happy to trade with the rest of the EU, still our main trade partner, on WTO terms. And the International Secretary seems to be worryingly in that category. But other Right Honourable and Honourable members on the Conservative benches disagree. The Right Honourable member for Broxo called it bonkers, and she is right, because it would mean a tariff on our exports, 10% on cars, 20% on beer and whiskey, and obviously it would mean non-tariff barriers on trade too. Mr. Speaker, it's already been mentioned by the Right Honourable Lady, but I think it's worth repeating. The Conservative Party manifesto last year stressed, we benefit from the single market. We are clear about what we want from Europe. We say yes to the single market. And this is the basis on which they've been elected to government. They were right last year, Mr. Speaker, which is why the government must push to retain access to the single market. The second test is this, and this is a really difficult one. Can the government mitigate the risks of leaving and maximise the opportunities? Again, so far, not so good. Many honourable and right honourable members on the Conservative benches seem to believe that there are only upsides to leaving the EU. But it is obvious that there are some fundamental risks to our economy if we get this wrong. The government should level with people and say to them, exiting the EU is not going to be straightforward. It's going to be difficult, sensitive, and indeed risky. I believe the government must aim for a soft Brexit. That's the best possible access to the single market without tariff and non-tariff barriers, to retain workers' rights and environmental protection and consumer protection and the security measures that are so vital to keeping our country safe. But I also believe that we do need to look at some restrictions on free movement. I had many conversations with constituents in Wolverhampton who voted to leave the EU. And they did so for a variety of reasons, but one of them was immigration. Now, some say that reconciling these two issues is impossible, but within the EEA, Norway has got an emergency brake on free movement, Liechtenstein has got controls over free movement, and within the four freedoms of people, capital, goods and services in the EU, we do not have absolute free movement of services. My third test, and I'm going to run out of time, I'll be very brief, is that the government should not be in denial about a point that my right honourable friend for Leeds Central made. We need to negotiate a transition period, because if we are going to negotiate a free trade deal with the rest of the EU, there is going to be a cliff edge between exiting and closing the Article 50 negotiations and the conclusion of that free trade deal, which will take years, because it will be a mixed deal and it will mean that there'll have to be ratification of national parliaments throughout the 27 member states. So I hope that the Brexit Secretary of State will not be in denial about this, because it's one of the most important aspects of our renegotiation, and I hope the government will start to do a lot better.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by saying there's probably no mistake that I wholly endorse and support the very wise words of my right honourable learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe, and of course my right honourable friend, the member for Loughborough. But I wholly endorse and support the very wise words from my new friend, the right honourable member for Doncaster North. And before anybody listening to this speech or reading about it elsewhere has a problem with that, may I just also agree with the short intervention from my right honourable learned friend, the member from Beaconsfield. Get real. We are living in extraordinary times, and incredible things have happened. Who would have believed a year ago we'd be here having this debate after all that has happened? And increasingly, and rightly so, many of us will be taking now a cross-party approach to all of this. Because as the right honourable learned member said, for Beaconsfield said, the situation our country is in, the situation we face as we leave the EU, and I accept the verdict, the referendum result. As we do these things, we are in very difficult, dangerous times, and putting our country first and the interests of all our constituents transcends everything, and that includes the normal party political divide. Could I pay handsome tribute also to these wise words I thought in the speech, apart from when it got partisan, from my learned, is it right honourable yet? Anyway, it matters not. The learned gentleman who represents Holborn and St Pancras. And I agree with him. We are in these difficult, dangerous times, and we tread with great carefulness. Because of this, as he rightly says, there was one question on that ballot paper, and it is wrong, therefore, to assume that there is a whole series of mandates that flow from that one simple and very straightforward question. And with great respect to the Prime Minister and her cabinet and all those in government, we are using that as an excuse for other mandates, and that is simply wrong. And I am very concerned about this extrapolation, as the new buzzword perhaps, that we just say, oh well, 52% of the British people voted for, apparently, controls on immigration. Well, those people that were concerned about immigration, as the Honourable Lady for Wolverhampton East has said, tread carefully, I would say to her, because when people were concerned about immigration, I suspect what they were really saying, not control, because control actually might make it go up. What they're really saying is they want less immigration. And may I gently say to her, you have to be true to what you believe in. And it is so important that in this debate that is now unfolding about immigration, one moment and I will, in this debate as it unfolds about immigration, we have got to be brave and true to what we believe in. And we've got to take people on in that debate. And my right honourable friend for Loughborough and I stood in Loughborough Market on the day of the referendum, and we had that debate, but the tragedy of it was, by that time it was too late. And if you make the debate, the British people at their heart are good and tolerant, and they will understand the huge benefit that migration has brought to our country for centuries. And I'll quickly give way.
Particularly grateful, and I agree with many of the things she said about immigration, but did she not, in 2015 and as again, I believe, in 2010, stand on a clear manifesto commitment on the part of this party, this side of the House, to reduce immigration, net immigration, to tens of thousands?
Gentleman is absolutely right, and I accept what he says. But let me say to you here and now today, I make it clear that we have to abandon that target. We can't keep it. We know the reality. People come here to work, And in simple terms, sir, who is going to do the jobs of these people who come here? There seems to be some nonsensical idea that with a bit of upskilling here and a bit of upskilling there, we will find the millions and millions of people who come and they work not just in those low-skilled work jobs, but right the way through to the highest levels of research and development, the great entrepreneurs. We should be singing out about this great country of ours. We should be making it clear we are open for business and we're open to people, as we always have been, because they contribute to our country, not just in economic terms, but in cultural terms. And I think we are in grave danger if we extrapolate in a way which I don't believe is at the core of being British. Can I end the time? Very quickly.
I agree with a lot of what she said, and I made the same arguments to people during the referendum campaign. But all I would say is that there is a spectrum here. There is a space between no free movement and free movement in its entirety. And I'm not arguing for no European immigration. I think they brought great contributions to our country, but I do think we need to look at restrictions in some sectors, in some areas. But I think that would be respecting the mandate.
Well, I'm not going to demur from what the Honourable Lady says. What I actually think this really proves is the absolute need for this place to do what this motion and the amendment says, which is exactly to have these debates as we go forward to shape our new relationship with Europe, and all these issues have to be debated. So I fully agree with everything that's been said, and I'll go one step further. The more I hear and the more I think about this, and I listen to the learned and wise words of people like my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, I'm now coming to the very quick, perhaps, conclusion that this place must vote on Article 50. I really do think that it is imperative that we do that. But I just want to add in the short time that's available to me this. We don't just come here to have these rather esoterical debates, and I think actually a lot of people listening to this might actually think that again, this is politicians talking in terms and in ways which perhaps don't relate to what's really happening out there in the real world. What's happening out there in the real world is that British business is in a very difficult and serious predicament. We've heard about the price of the pound, the value of the pound at this record 30-year low. What does that mean? It means that a friend of mine last night sent me a text to say that her small business is now on the verge of going under. That is the reality of what is happening. It means that a great company like mine, Fresh Cut Foods in my constituency, is seeing its best EU workers leaving. They feel, as the Right Honourable Lady for Rathborough says, they feel they have no place here. They're finding, as the University of Nottingham have said to me, that they can no longer recruit. They've lost some of their best academics because they feel no longer welcome and valued in our country. And I'm sorry, it has to be said, we should be holding our heads with shame that that is the feeling that real people have, real constituents of mine. And I will continue to speak out on their behalf. I can't, I'm so sorry. I also want to say this, Mr. Speaker, because I think it's really important. We talk about wanting to build a consensus, and right honourable members like the honourable gentleman who represents Doncaster North talked about if you want to build a consensus, you're going to have to bring in now the 48% who voted for us to remain in the European Union. And I don't agree with the right honourable gentleman when he said that they were rejecting the European. Absolute nonsense. They were positively voting for our membership of the European Union, and that included membership of the single market, and it included free movement of workers. And we ignore those brave, good people at our peril. And I feel so many of them feel that they have been forgotten. They are invariably abused on social media, and we ignore them, as I say, at our great peril. And I have no difficulty in standing here and saying I will not give up on the 48%, and I'll go further. I think that there is a real movement now for many people who voted leave as Brexit unravels and they see the reality of that referendum result. Many are regretting their vote, and it is a good chance that that 48% may in due course actually become the majority. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I'll say this gently to the honourable gentleman for Stone. There's a real danger in our country. 75% of those young voters voted Remain, and many of them feel an older generation has robbed them of their future. Our job is to make sure that everybody is involved and we get the best deal for everybody in our country as we now leave the European Union.
Jack Droomy.
Mr. Speaker, unlike some of the fantasists and ideologues on the benches opposite who somehow believe that Brexit is a pain-free process, I live in the real world. We do not deny that the British people have voted to leave the European Union. We do not deny that. But what we are determined on our benches to achieve is a Brexit for working people. Not a hard Brexit, not a Brexit at breakneck speed, but a Brexit that does not damage Britain's national interests, the interests of our economy and the interests of our workers. And what also we are determined to do, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for the outstanding speech she just made, what also we're determined to do is that Parliament should have the opportunity to call the government to account at key stages, at the next stages. And I'd like to pay tribute in particular to the Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras, an outstanding lawyer, and also somebody who has led, and quite rightly, the argument that this House should call government to account. Now, I want to make 3 points. First, on Jaguar Land Rover. Can I just tell a story? About 3 months ago, I was getting out of my car in Edwards Road, and I heard Jack, a voice, and it was Warren, big bear of a man with a beard. I'd first met him at a jobs fair we organised 4 years ago, and he got an apprenticeship into Jaguar Land Rover. He said, "Come with me. I want you to meet my partner and her mum and dad." Jack, I can't believe it. Little Edwardian house. We're moving into the house of my dreams. I'm with the woman of my dreams, and it's because I've got a good and secure job in the Jaguar plant. And for me, forgive me if I say this, what drives me on is I don't want to see, in an area, as I said earlier, which is rich in talent but is one of the poorest in the country, I don't want to see the Warrens of this world let down at the next stages. Now, I was deeply involved in the drive to secure the future of Jaguar Land Rover back in 2010. It's gone from strength to strength ever since. The new engine plant, for example, in Wolverhampton, 42,000 people employed. And I want to pay tribute both to the workforce, but also one of the most outstanding, if not the most outstanding chief executive I've ever worked with, Ralph Specht. It is a world-class company. But when they express concerns over the consequences for them of hard Brexit without being able to sell without tariffs into the European Union, that voice has to be listened to. Secondly, on workers' rights. The Secretary of State said earlier on, "Don't worry, all will be okay." I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I was a Brexiteer back in the 1970s. What changed my mind was social Europe in the 1980s. And I remember taking the case of the Eastbourne dustman to the European Court of Justice because a then Conservative government had refused to extend TUPE to cover 6 million public servants, with terrible consequences of tens of thousands were privatised without protection, pay cut in half, workforce cut sometimes by a third.
I thank my honourable friend for giving me. I thank my honourable friend for giving me a clue to what might happen after Brexit in terms of trade union rights or industrial rights. Dead simple. Look at the last trade union bill. That's a good clue.
Yes, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. And then in the 1980s, and now some of the leading Brexiteers are the ones who talk forever about red tape. Well, I call that workers' rights. And when they say, "Trust us," I say, what? Trust the same people who ran a disreputable campaign promising £350 million for the National Health Service when they knew damn well there was no possibility of delivering that. And the third and final point I want to make is on this very difficult issue of the debate about immigration. I have to say that the way that some in the Brexit camp played the race and immigration card in the referendum was nothing short of shameful. Whether it was on the one hand that infamous poster with Nigel Farage, or on the other hand, dare I say it, the Foreign Secretary talking about tens of millions of Turks who might come to our country. And the consequences of that has been very serious indeed. The rise in hate crime in my constituency, Poles in Erdington High Street being told, "Go back home." An Afro-Caribbean man who's been here for 40 years told, "Go back home." A Kashmiri taxi driver who's been here for 35 years told, go back home. And a train guard threatened by an aggressive, large white man, as he explained. He was an Asian train guard. He was shutting the doors. Hang on, my mates are 5 minutes away. The train guard said, the train's got to go, the train's got to go. And he pointed his finger an inch from his nose and he said, oh no you don't, we make the rules now. That kind of brutish behaviour, I thought that was something of the past. And forgive me if I say this, my dad came from County Cork to dig roads. My mother came from Tipperary to train as a nurse. I was 13 years old when my dad told me for the first time, and I couldn't believe it. I adored him, and he couldn't look at me in the eyes. He looked down at the floor, and he said that he told me about what it was like to arrive looking for lodging houses in Kilburn and Cricklewood and see those infamous signs up of no dogs, no Irish. I thought that we had fundamentally changed as a country, but this country is scarred by the way that the referendum campaign was conducted. And at the next stages, I recognise there's a difficult debate, because on the one hand, we have the needs of the economy and the National Health Service, but on the other hand, we've got to listen to the voice of the millions who, from discontent, voted Brexit, and we have to ensure, therefore, that no one in our country is left behind. And getting that balance right is immensely difficult. But what I hope all parties will do, because certainly we, the Labour Party, will do it, that we don't have a repeat of that shameful, divisive rhetoric, because the consequences for the people that we represent in our constituencies are very serious indeed. And when I go into a local secondary school and I meet with this diverse group of pupils, aged 16 and 17, and I'm told that on the Friday after the Thursday, they came out saying, will we be sent back home? The following week, some of them were racially abused in the street. We have to stand together to say, to have the debate about the future, absolutely, but not a debate ever again scarred by racism.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to return to the topic under debate, which is how this House will scrutinise the Brexit process. And to do that, I think we need to go back to first principles. What is the power and authority of this House? What is the sovereignty of Parliament, and where does it come from? And here I think I take a view that will be popular with the SNP, that I believe that the sovereignty of Parliament is delegated by the British people. We don't have sovereignty in this House in a vacuum. It is not that God suddenly created the House of Commons and said it will be sovereign over the United Kingdom. It is that the British people every 5 years delegate their sovereignty, their rights to us to implement as we see fit and present ourselves for re-election when that period is ended. Within that, we have had a referendum. And it is fascinating, we hear from all sides, from left, right and centre. We hear that everyone has accepted the result, that the will of the British people must be obeyed, respected, followed. The will of the people of the United Kingdom and Great Britain of Northern Ireland, which I'm glad to say includes the good people, indeed the Crofters of Nihilling and Anyar. And that is something that needs to be put into practice. But we also know, because this is the legal advice that has gone unchallenged, that the only legal way of leaving the European Union is exercising Article 50. So we know that the vote on the 23rd of June was a vote to exercise Article 50. All that is at debate is the point at which that has done. The big decision has been taken, and has been taken by the British people. Of course I'll give way.
He and I are in rather similar positions. The Rhondda voted to leave, but I support Remain. North East Somerset voted to remain, but he supported leave. Does he fully accept that, given what he said about sovereignty, that all of us in this House are not sent as delegates, we're here as representatives, and we owe to our constituents our conscience as much as our vote?
The honourable gentleman should check the record. Unfortunately, North East Somerset was not counted separately. We were infected by the votes of people in Bath. So I'm pretty confident that the wise people of rural Somerset voted to leave, whilst the urbanites in Bath voted to remain. But once Parliament has used that delegated authority to ask the people, who are our employers after all, what their will is, then that must be followed, and everybody is accepting that. So we come to the point of debating when will we put the notice under Article 50 to the European Council, so that they know that that is our decision. And that is properly something that is determined by the government. And this is where we get into the constitutional norms. Mr. Speaker, you have raised the standard of parliamentary scrutiny of the executive in the last 6 or 7 years to a proper height. And I am so strongly supportive of that continuing. We should all, particularly backbenchers on the governing party, remember that we are here to hold the government to account, not just willy-nilly to support it. But within that, we must recognise that there is a proper and constitutional sphere for government activity. There is and long has been a separation of powers. What the government does is introduces its policy, it introduces its legislation to get that policy through, and it has the clear responsibility for the negotiation of treaties. Against that, no government can exist unless it has the confidence of this House. At any day, if the Leader of the Opposition chooses to put down a vote of no confidence in Her Majesty's government, Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, you will take that motion urgently. And therefore, if there is any part of the negotiation, if there is any part of the discussion that takes place that this House resents or opposes, then the government may be removed and a new one put in its place. But that doesn't mean we should prevent the government exercising the proper role of the executive, because it is answerable to us in how it uses that power, and it's already been shown how often this happens. We have had 2 statements from the Brexit Secretary. We have a committee that has just been set up, voted for last night, that will hold both of the new departments, the 2 new departments, to account, that will have select committee hearings. As it happens, I think there will be a vote on Article 50. I wonder if I may draw the House's attention to Standing Order 143, 1.2 and 1.6, which provide for the type of documents that go to the European Scrutiny Committee for consideration. It is very hard to see that the exercise of Article 50 falls outside the definition listed in Standing Order 143. And it seems to me that the European Scrutiny Committee, which has the responsibility for determining what matters are of sufficient legal and political importance to be debated, would decide that the exercise of Article 50 did not meet that test for legal and political significance. So though it is right for the government to determine the date, though it is a proper exercise both of the prerogative and of the executive arm of our system, nonetheless, under our own standing orders, it will almost certainly come before this House, as will the other parts of the process. That the Great Repeal Bill is an interesting approach, but a very sensible one that the government has decided upon, because it gives certainty. We have heard calls for certainty from the opposition benches again and again, but making it clear, business certainty, the honourable gentleman calls out from Scunthorpe. So the voice of Scunthorpe speaks and calls from a height for certainty. And that is right, because business will have certainty, because the law will not change on the day we leave. All the laws will have been repatriated. They will be our laws rather than domesticated, as they currently are, through the European Communities Act 1972. It then becomes a matter for routine political debate as to whether we keep the regulations that have come from the European Union or whether we get rid of them. I have a feeling that I would want to get rid of rather more than members of the opposition would. But then I must put that to the electorate in North East Somerset, the honourable gentleman has put it to the electors of Scunthorpe, and we will find out what the people want. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the great prize of Brexit. For as we debate how this House will scrutinise, suddenly we're in charge of scrutinising everything. We haven't delegated our powers to Brussels to determine how we are regulated with a mere cursory glance over the top when the rules come pouring in. We have given back to this House the right to determine how we are governed, and therefore I think this motion is misplaced and misfires, because what it is suggesting is that there will be proper scrutiny of the executive in the process of leaving, which is wrong. There is every step of the way going to be considerable scrutiny, which has already started, but it implies that the situation might be worse than it was before, when the reverse is true. We suddenly recapture that ancient power that we have had to seek redress of grievance because the government can't say not decided here, to legislate because our laws cannot be overturned by judges in a foreign land, and to hold the government to account on behalf of our electors. This is the great democratic prize, and it is from this that our prosperity will come, because we know that our prosperity does not exist in a vacuum. It comes because of the constitutional systems that we have that allow for stability for business, the rule of law, and for capitalism to flourish. When we are doing it for ourselves, that will be better, it will be stronger, and it will be more democratic.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman and his mellifluous tones and his unbridled optimism for the future of the country, which some of us don't share in quite the same rose-tinted way. Leaving the European Union tears up a 50-year-old strategy which sought to replace our imperial past with closer economic and political cooperation with the European Union democracies. Only one thing is now certain: unravelling 45 years of economic integration and political cooperation with our nearest neighbours is not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to be cost-free. And the new administration has made a very worrying and dangerous start. The meaningless chant of Brexit means Brexit. The imperial-style announcements from on high at Tory party conference, and the spectacle of the Right Honourable Member for Halton, Price and Howden sneering that parliamentary sovereignty is micromanagement. Now he's graduated from the backbench to his ministerial limousine. This arrogance ill-suits an administration with no mandate for pursuing hard Brexit by diktat, with no mandate to take us out of the single market, landing us with tariffs in our most important export market, and an economic shock which leaked Treasury documents yesterday put as high as 10% of GDP. There are many ways, Mr. Speaker, to leave the European Union. The result of the referendum does not give this government carte blanche to choose the most damaging one. Surely we haven't taken back control only to surrender it to the Prime Minister and her increasingly absurd three Brexiteers, while Parliament becomes a spectator. Surely it is only right that we start a national conversation about the best way forward for our country in these new circumstances. Surely we need a cross-party agreement on the best way forward, because the results of the government's decisions on how we leave will affect our future prospects for generations to come. And who can argue that with the pound, I hear, now trading at a 168-year low? Worse still, the xenophobic noises coming out of Birmingham last week and the failure to reassure EU citizens who are living and working in the UK, or indeed UK citizens living and working in the EU, is causing needless anxiety and fear. The rise in racist and homophobic hate crimes in the aftermath of the vote is shaming our nation and besmirching our international reputation. So I now offer some principles on the way forward which are clear and pressing, and I mention only a few. Workers should not pay the price of Brexit. The poorest and most vulnerable should not pay the price of Brexit. Whilst we welcome the Chancellor's guarantees on existing EU funds, we need more details of what is actually being protected. There are some £200 million of vital investment at risk in Merseyside alone. We should avoid a race to the bottom by guaranteeing that our worker and corporate regulations do not deliberately undercut EU standards, maintaining goodwill and links in what will still be our largest market. We need to think ambitiously about what would constitute a modern industrial base which would allow us to compete in a changing world.
Honourable Lady, for giving way, she's reading out an admirable list there. There's also another fantasy that's peddled on the other side of the House, that the UK alone, outside the single market, will get tariff-free access inside the single market. If it was so easy to get tariff-free access inside the single market, there'd be a whole host of other countries at the moment with tariff-free access. They don't, they won't, they can't, and they're misleading the people with that.
I'm afraid I agree with the honourable gentleman's analysis. He's right to make that point. We also know that entrepreneurial activity, risk-taking and creativity will be crucial in driving Britain's future success, alongside an active state which both rewards success and leaves no one behind. But the uncertainty about our future trade arrangements in this context is extremely damaging, and it's damaging our interests now. We must ensure the enormous globe-spanning corporations pay their fair share of taxes so that we can invest into opportunities for all Britons. This will require increased global cooperation, not less. Britain must therefore be at the forefront of international institutions that set the rules by which business is done across our globe. It's now, Mr. Speaker, imperative that the government sets out the tests against which any deal to leave the EU must be judged, and we haven't heard it from them yet. How does our future relationship with Europe bolster and underpin a more activist national industrial strategy which delivers more jobs for the future and greater investment and growth in our economy? How will we heal the divisions in our country which set city against town, young against old, and communities against each other? How can we maintain and enhance the collective security of Britain and its allies and maintain the current cooperation which allows cross-border crime and terrorism to be thwarted and prosecuted? And how can Britain remain an engaged and influential world power that has a seat at the table setting the rules by which nations and corporations have to abide? Leaving the EU, Mr. Speaker, is a complex process which will cause great damage if it's botched. This is a challenge which will require the Prime Minister to unite a divided nation. She cannot succeed locked in a room with a few advisers. She will need all of us to play our part as members of Parliament. She will need this place to play its part. She will need citizens to play their part too, helping us to reassess from first principles who we are, who we want to be, how we can make our way in the world, how we can be prosperous, and how we can achieve our ambitions. If she carries on, Mr. Speaker, as she has started, she will not succeed. It's not too late, though, for her to change course and change her approach. And for the sake of my constituents in Wallasey and all of our constituents, I hope she does so.
Mr. Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady who has grasped and conveyed the extent of the debate and discussion we're now in. I'm delighted to get the chance to speak. Like my Right Honourable friend, the member for Loughborough, I've had fewer occasions to speak about Europe over the years than I might have wished, following a very enjoyable ministerial career. I missed particularly not being able to say something in the Commons before the referendum. And I would like to just put on record now what I told my electors, that contrary to popular opinion, not all Conservative MPs are reluctant Europeans. I believe that this country prospered in the European Union. I believe that our sovereignty and independence were always intact. I believe that we were enhanced by our membership of the European Union, just as the European Union was enhanced by our membership of it. And I believe that with a political lifetime of relationships with colleagues in different European parties, in different European countries, remembering what they had been through over the past century to build the European Union is all that it meant. I listened with despair and sometimes shame to the mischaracterisation of the EU in the way it was by the drip of poison for too long, often from those lips that should have known a damn sight better. But I didn't. get a chance to say that in the House before the referendum, but I say it now. I don't want to concentrate on this debate, if I may, about the detail. We've heard a lot about the detail of the negotiations that are going to come, and I think the House and the country is now getting a sense of just how complex that will be. I want to concentrate on why the process set forward in the motion by honourable members, right honourable and honourable members opposite, and agreed to and enhanced by the rider offered by the government, why that motion is so important and why the process we're talking about is so important to us today. The context of the referendum is different from the context of a general election. We weren't looking at delivering a manifesto complete in which a political party was elected which it had to defend to the death. The people made a decision. The government didn't win, the opposition didn't win. But we have collectively to put into practice what the people has told us to do. And I, for one, like others, accept the decision of June the 23rd. And my role on behalf of my constituents is to make it work. But the point is this. Of things that were revealed to us during the referendum campaign, one thing was clear. It was a disdain by the public for the political process in the main. They said to us how they felt excluded by the process. They didn't like the campaign because it exaggerated in all cases what could or could not be done, and people thought both sides told downright lies in order to enhance their case. It wasn't our finest hour, and it fitted with their view of how they think this place works, how party politics works, and how Westminster works. The referendum gives us an opportunity to do things differently, because we have an opportunity to engage the people in a different way. If we do it the same old way, we won't take the people with us. We won't be able to build a consensus of the 52-48% as we look towards a new future. If it's the same old story, the public will still feel removed from us. It's been a good start today. The natural inclination of any government is to reject an opposition motion outright. It didn't do so. And I think that's to great credit. There's a listening exercise going on. But we've got to go on from there. I think select committees have a great role to play. Let's bring people in front of our select committees to explain in detail what they think about the process to come, because they're really affected. And as I said to the Secretary of State the other day, what I most want to hear is a process whereby what we hear from people who are affected has some influence on the passage taken by the government, because that's what engagement with this place really needs. The sort of things that might be considered. I've met with Peter Kendall of the National Farmers Union, who's very concerned about where agriculture goes. And it's not just agriculture, it's welfare, it's environment, all wrapped up together. If people come before select committees, if people come before the House in a way which is not party political, there is an authority now with select committees that has been gained over recent years, which I think will matter to the public, because they'll feel it represents more of their voice and more of the truth. There is a tone that the outside world can bring and Parliament can bring to the negotiations. I too resent bitterly the way in which this has been characterised as adversarial. It's us versus them. We have got to win. Just a small point. Does anybody not believe that those sitting around the negotiating table with the United Kingdom have their own interests as well, and they will fight for them? And just as the argument here about whether or not we stayed in the EU wasn't just about the economics, it was about politics, it was about our sovereignty, it was about taking back control. Do we not think for a second that Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande do not also have political reasons for believing that the European Union needs to be protected in some way from the poor or adverse effects that Brexit may have, and they will put those forward as well? It's not all about us, and those from outside can bring that view to us. So if we do that, if we bring people together, if we give the public a sense that we're not doing business as usual, we are more cooperative here, more consensual here, and driving things forward, then we and the political process will have gained hugely by showing it's not the same old story.
McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, between the date of the referendum and the start of the Conservative Party conference, not a lot was clear about the government's intentions. There were various statements from the three Brexiteer ministers, and they were one by one slapped down over either the customs union, or the single market or the timing of the invoking of Article 50. But that lack of clarity changed at the Conservative Party conference, and one thing became clear, and that was that the government has decided that limiting immigration from elsewhere in the European Union must be the driver of everything else. This is their overriding priority as they approach these negotiations. And all other considerations, be they economic, security, trade or any other field, must take second place to that. The government's policy is immigration first, economics and everything else second. And the markets have expressed their view on those priorities. The pound is plummeting in value. That slide started with the referendum result, and it has been sharpened since the Conservative Party conference. And as my right honourable friend, the member for Wallasey, said, reports are that it is now trading at a 168-year low. And the nonchalant attitude of ministers to this is woefully complacent. Yeah. The Prime Minister said in a recent newspaper review that her modus operandi was as follows, and I quote, "I don't just make an instant decision. I look at the evidence, take the advice, consider it properly, and then come to a decision." Perhaps the Minister, in his summing up, can tell us what was the economic assessment made for the stance taken by the Prime Minister and the other Cabinet Ministers at the Conservative Party conference. What impact will it have, this hard Brexit, outside the single market, outside the customs union, on our manufacturing industry, or our financial services, or agriculture, or the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic? What were the papers that the Prime Minister spoke of? What was this careful process? Isn't the truth that there was no process at all? There was no looking at the evidence. There was no taking advice. There was no considering it properly. Instead, a desire for headlines and for appeasing the hard Brexiteers in her own party took priority over the national interest. So on the substance of the motion before us, the 170 questions published today by my frontbench colleagues are entirely legitimate questions to ask on behalf of our constituents. Yes. The public has a right to know about our future trading arrangements, security arrangements, border arrangements and so on. The government cannot shut down legitimate questioning of their policy by proclaiming that anyone who questions their direction or intent is trying to deny the result of the referendum. That is simply not the case. And the sight of these erstwhile champions of parliamentary sovereignty desperately pleading that the executive now be given a blank cheque for anything they want to do may be amusing on one level, but it will not hold in terms of how this process will proceed.
I'm glad. I've heard that mantra repeated again and again and again, notwithstanding having voted to remain, that honourable members accept the will of the electorate. But then when the mask slipped, as it did during my right honourable friend's speech for Boxthrow, of course she's entitled to her view. But when that mask slipped, it was cheered on the other side. Do they really accept the will of the voters, or is this a ruse to actually thwart Brexit?
The attempt by the honourable member and others to shut down questioning of the government's intentions is simply an attempt to shut down discussion and scrutiny, and it will not stand. Ask ourselves for a moment if the result had been the other way round. What if it was 52-48 to remain? Do we seriously think that honourable members here who had supported a leave vote would have stopped asking questions about the government's EU policy, would have said that all future decisions relating to the EU are purely a matter for the executive? No, they would not, and such a proposition is totally absurd. So I welcome the government's partial climb down in their amendment to today's motion. But ministers must realise that members on this side will keep pressing for the facts, keep pressing for discussion, and will keep pressing for a parliamentary say over the terms of Brexit itself. And let me make one other point on this. It is reported that in another context, the former United States Secretary of State, Colin Powell, once said, "If you break it, you bought it," sometimes referred to as the Pottery Barn rule. Well, those who led the Leave campaign, many of whom are now ministers in the government, should remember that phrase, "You break it, you bought it." Because what has been broken is our membership of the European Union. So they now own the consequences. They own the drop in the value of the pound. When great companies like Nissan say that they will suspend investment, they own the announcement of that suspension of investment. They own promises like £350 million a week extra for the NHS, which will not be forgotten or set aside. And that phrase, "If you break it, you bought it," is not just a phrase for today's debate, but it will ring through every decision and every consequence in the years ahead.
Order, I'm afraid the limit on backbench speeches has with immediate effect to be reduced to 4 minutes. The first person to be subject to that limit, the honourable gentleman, the member for Grantham and Stamford, has had notice of that. Mr Nicholas Bowles.
Mr Speaker, I will just have to hope that you didn't reduce the limit simply because you saw me standing up eagerly, hoping to speak in this debate. In my first speech on the backbenches since leaving the government, and I rise to contribute to what I think has been a very good and interesting debate. I'm very pleased at the fact that the government's amendment made quite clear that there is absolutely no intention and no desire to stop the House of Commons from discussing what should be the nature of our future relationship with the European Union. I think it would be absurd for any government to have tried to deny that opportunity, and it's quite clear that this government has no intention of doing so. And indeed, I slightly wonder if the Secretary of State, who's not in his place, is ever going to have time to go and actually do the negotiation. So much time does he seem to be spending both in this House and in the other House, the other end. But I rise to offer a very particular perspective, one shared, I note, by 70% of the members of the loyal opposition. And that is that I was someone who campaigned for Remain, campaigned energetically and convincedly for Remain. But I represent a constituency that voted very heavily to leave the European Union. And I would say gently to those others who are in my position that it is not good enough to just say that you accept the result or that you respect the result. Do you understand the result? Have you sought to examine in yourself and in your constituents why they were led to reject your advice, why my constituents rejected my advice, why they rejected the advice of all party leaders apart from the lead of the UK Independence Party that fortunately has never managed to make it into this place? Why was that the case? Have you examined that? And it's not enough, I'm afraid, it's not good enough to then persist with all of the views that you had previously and carry on arguing them as if nothing had changed. Now, the honourable member for Rhondda, who's in the same position, very appropriately raised that classic Burke line that we all like to use, that we don't owe the people, and I don't know the words, the automatic response, we owe them our judgment. He used the word conscience, I think judgment is the word that Burke used, and that we'd be doing them a disservice if we did otherwise. He's right, of course, but we all like to hide behind that proposition. And I think he's right when it comes to moral issues. But I'm not sure if he is right when it comes to huge issues of our national future, of our strategy, of our economic arrangements and our political arrangements. I think the fact that nearly 70% of my constituents voted, despite a campaign that aired all of the issues exhaustively and exhaustingly, voted to leave the European Union, does need to change my views about some of the arrangements that we enter into in order to secure the goals that we seek. And that leads me, Mr. Speaker, on to my second point.
which is when we start this process of scrutiny, please can we start by talking about ends, not means. I too want to have an immigration system that enables me to see the doctors recruited that can see my A&E in Grantham being reopened 24 hours a day. I too want to see students coming and studying in our universities. I too want to see the most talented people from all around the world coming to support British industry and help it compete. But the single market and freedom of movement is not the only way of achieving that outcome, and we need to open our minds to different processes that can lead to the ends that we all seek.
Gisela Stewart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think what this afternoon has shown us is that there are still some very sore feelings on both sides of the argument, and that we are slowly moving to a point of overcoming any hurt and sometimes bitterness at what has happened. And I would really recommend to everyone the speech by the member for North East Bedfordshire, not just for what he said, but also I think the tone in which he delivered it. Because as the suffragettes would have said, it's not just words, but it's deeds. At the same time as it's all very well to say, yes, now we all must be very friendly together and we must really make this together, but deliver it in such a tone which says there's still a lot of healing to be done. And I think that was also clear in the speech by the member for Stamford, Grantham and Stamford. And I want us to move on to a point where we actually start to look beyond the process and some of the policies. Because unless we're starting to get to the point where there's some elements of agreement of what the vote to leave meant, and in the context of the language, I rather regret that we ended up with the term Brexit. It was a vote to leave. And it was a vote to have control over your laws, your taxes, your borders, and hold those who made those decisions on those three areas accountable, and most importantly, remove them if you disagree with that. And yes, we all talk to our voters, but I just want to raise two things. One is an initiative which was started today by Change Britain, an organisation which I chair, and it's called Welcome to Stay. And it's asked people to sign up to the basic principle of the EU citizens who are here and have rights. We should recognise those rights as soon as possible and make sure that we continue to be an open, outward-looking and welcoming country. And that would not just be important for the United Kingdom, it is equally important for UK citizens living in the rest of Europe. And I think the sooner we can establish that, the better it will be, but also it will establish a tone of the continued debate. Certainly.
Does she also agree that we need to... Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does she also agree that we need to clarify the situation for those who might want to invest or be living here in the next 2 years? I heard today in my constituency of a contract that has been lost because of somebody who is a German national, was going to invest and is now uncertain as to where he would be and what his status would be in 2 years' time.
I think she's right that to actually overcome uncertainty must be a priority. But I have to say that if I have to choose what should come first, I think people's status for me is more important. People are being allowed to plan, and then we talk about the trade arrangements. But she's right. We have to get the best deal for this country. And over the last few weeks, I've not just talked to constituents, but also in the context of Change Britain, we've been gone out and have to talk to a lot of people across the country. And in the subject of immigration, which was something which was really significant and important, it was quite clear that what was coming back in those focus groups was actually a belief that democracy meant that you had a say on what the rules are, that they wanted those rules to be fair, they wanted those rules to apply equally to every member from outside the United Kingdom, whether it was the EU or not. They wanted to make sure that the working class communities, which many of the Labour voters particularly represent, who voted in significant numbers to leave, that for them it was the politicians should deliver their promises. And I think it's particularly for the Labour side a real challenge that if our constituencies have voted one way, our party's position was another, we really should not now go around and say, oh, anything bad that now happens from now on is the fault of your decision. There is a moment for all of us to actually spend a lot of time of listening to what people have said, because what that referendum has shown us, it has shown us two things. One is, I think we need to revisit the basis on which we fight referenda in terms of how they fit in with our parliamentary processes, but let's park that. But the second thing is a deep disillusionment with the political processes, and those will not be healed by us having a friendly or sometimes not so friendly banter across these benches. They will only be healed if we start to go out in a non-partisan way, listen to what people are saying to us in a non-judgmental way, and then respond, particularly to those areas who feel that they have been left behind. I think we've started to take the first step in that process today, but we should recognise it's only the first start. When we talk about seeking consensus, it's a responsibility on both sides to actually try and achieve that. And if we want to put the national interest first, we should start by showing it in here, that the nation matters more.
I'm very grateful to you, sir, for calling me. And it's often struck me in the course of this debate that you, Mr. Speaker, are chairing a group therapy session. There are many, many ranges of response to the referendum on the 23rd. Of course, we've got the 5 stages of grief. Some people are still in denial. Some people feel very angry. Others are in the bargaining stage. Not a few are depressed. And of course, a large number accept the result. And that's actually what we need to do. We all need to accept this result and to move on. And when the Prime Minister said Brexit means Brexit, that seems to me a palpably obvious tautology, which means we know what it doesn't mean. We know it means that we are leaving the EU and that we are not continuing the relationship of Britain with the EU on the basis that had dominated, or rather that had formed the architecture for 43 years. Things have got to change, and they will change. With the full debate, with the full scrutiny of this House, we will reach a conclusion where we are in a different place. We're in a different place. We've respected our constituents, as my right honourable friend, the member for Grantham and Stamford, has suggested. We have listened and absorbed, and we've moved on, and things have changed. Now, with regard to the single market, there are lots of different strands of opinion. It was clear, it was said again and again by the previous Prime Minister and the previous Chancellor, that if we were to vote to leave, that was part of their argument, if we were to vote to leave on the 23rd of June, we would leave the single market. Now, I accept that that's still open for discussion, but it was very clear to me and very clear to millions of people that the single market was, in effect, one of the silver bullets of the Remain case. They said they used Project Fear. They said that house prices in London would go down 20%. They even suggested, I think one or two of them, that we wouldn't have Europeans who could play in our Premier League. They made all sorts of claims. They made all sorts of allegations, many of which were proved false. And it's interesting to me, I've never seen Labour members so keenly following the stock market and the currency market. It's that I regard as an encouraging development. But of course, ahead of the vote, they said the stock market would crash, and of course the day afterwards the stock market did fall, and they said, there you are, the stock market has fallen. And now they're saying, well, the stock market's gone up because the currency's gone down, so therefore we were right. You can't argue it both ways. And the last thing I would say, and I'm throwing this out there as it were, is that the single market has now become essentially the last redoubt, the last bastion of the Remain campaign. The first outer walls have been stormed, and now they are retreating to this totem, this tower of the single market. Examine the single market. Examine what it is. There's this absurd delusion that somehow retaining access to the single market means that we have to be in the single market. Whereas we know that most countries in the world have plentiful access to the market, but they're not members of the market. It's not a binary thing. Just as it's not a binary thing to say that we want to control immigration but we want to be able to control it, not to end it. These are false oppositions that are endlessly being rehearsed, and I'm afraid they cloud and they demean the debate by obscuring what should be clear points that we're all making on behalf of our constituents and on behalf of this country.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've often thought about the lessons we in the Scottish National Party can learn, both from this referendum and the referendum in Scotland 2 years ago. Mr. Speaker, if some honourable members find themselves in a confusing position, think how we feel. We're on both the winning and the losing side of this referendum, because, of course, we won the argument in Scotland where we did our campaigning, but the UK-wide vote was to leave. And yes, I do indeed accept that the UK's vote was to leave, but politics in Scotland is raw, as honourable members will know. And if the House would put even a smidgen of the effort it has put into political healing this afternoon into the Scottish political debate, rather than any time independence is mentioned, we are constantly told, you voted to stay in the UK, back in your box and be quiet, we'd have a much better politics and political debate across these islands. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to, and so it seems to continue here just now, before the 23rd of June, many people were told it's time to take their country back, it's time to vote leave and take back control. And I remember coming to London on the Sunday after the referendum and passing through Parliament Square and seeing a sign held up by someone who had voted to remain, and it said, "I want my country back." And that's how many of us still feel. And I think part of the problem is that the Leave side hasn't thought about how to own its victory. That was evidenced in the campaign itself, and I don't claim by any means that the Remain side was perfect, far from it, and it's evidenced here today as well. I think the Honourable Lady for Birmingham Edgbaston is right. I think we've started to see the process of political healing here this afternoon, but it does need to go further. Because if we continue with this boundary of us versus them, as we see in the Daily Mail today, the Ramoners, as we're sometimes called, rather ironic from a newspaper that's done nothing but moan about the European Union for 40 years, I have to say, then we will not move forward. And the politics of grievance, of confusion, will set in, and that is a threat to community cohesion, it's a threat to our economy and our international standing in the world. Mr. Speaker, it is a responsibility of all members on this House to ask questions, to scrutinise the government's plans and indeed inform them. Brexit means Brexit was enough to get the Prime Minister through her coronation and her summer, but that has gone now. We now need to see some meat on the bones. And there is no point in replacing one political project, the European Union, which many members felt that it was something that was done to them rather than included them, with a Brexit process that will equally be something that is done to people as opposed to one that will include people. Now, you may think as an SNP member it's my job to undermine this place as much as possible. And I don't come here with any secret agenda to try and block the vote, as has been suggested, to try and thwart the ability of the government to negotiate on our behalf. My party, indeed all members, want to see a successful negotiation with the other EU member states, because irrespective of where constitutional politics in Scotland goes over the coming time, and I have my own views on that, as you would expect, we want to see a successful rest of the United Kingdom as well. It is in all of our interests. I think we've started to move in the right direction. I only hope government members will keep that up as we move forward.
Ria Miller.
Mr. Speaker. It's been an impassioned debate with a great deal of hyperbole, I think, at times on both sides. But the opposition motion today is about scrutiny, and we shouldn't forget that. And it's a principle that's been explicitly accepted by the government in its amendment that is already tabled, and we should welcome that. Mr. Speaker, I think there's an arrogance creeping into the debate today, which I think we should take great care about, because there's only one certainty coming out of the referendum decision in June, and that's the vote to leave the EU. And I was a Remainer, so I put that on the record. Nothing else is certain at this point. Members on both sides advocating membership or not of this, or freedom to trade within the single market, freedom of movement, no freedom of movement. I have to say, our EU partners listening today may be forgiven for thinking that there is more than a touch of arrogance coming from the British Parliament at this stage, because the truth is that it's all up for grabs, and it's not for us to determine the outcome of this stage. We may well remain with trading within the single market. I certainly hope so. But that is what this negotiation is all about. My honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, said, get real. And I think she's right, but for slightly different reasons. Because why should those who will remain within the EU reward members who choose to leave? I think we do need to get real. We're leaving the biggest trading bloc in the world. The members of that trading bloc want to continue to sell their goods to us, and we want to sell ours to them. But that will come with some sort of price or issues attached. And we can romanticise all we want about this, but at the end of the day, it will come down to hard economic facts, and I have to say the capability of ministers sitting on the front bench here today. And I think we should get behind them and perhaps show a little bit more support, and then maybe we could show the united front that I believe we should. Because the government's challenge is to turn this theory and rhetoric into practice. And I believe that the basic rule of negotiation is something the government should acknowledge at this point, is you're only as strong as your ability to walk away. And the World Trade Organization terms are actually, in practice, our starting point. I hope that isn't where we end up, but we should be honest and say that if we don't acknowledge that, then actually our starting point in these negotiations are fundamentally flawed. There is no clarity about what Brexit means at this stage, and my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, is absolutely right. It's full of contradictions. Even now, when I go in to speak to students and businesses in my own constituency, which did vote marginally to leave the EU, there are contradictions, whether it's about control of migration on one hand, but on the other hand, the ability of students to be able to go and study abroad and work abroad. On one hand, wanting to make sure that we have flexibility, on the other hand, to make sure that we've got protections. And it is for the government to work these things out. They are complicated, difficult negotiations, and they deserve all of our support. But I think in tabling the amendments today, what the government has done, it's demonstrated that it fully understands the need for full and transparent debate. And that is where Parliament comes into play. I think members opposite should be supporting the government's amendment today, and I think I've read in the press that perhaps you do. I wasn't quite so clear when the Shadow Secretary of State spoke whether that was the case. I hope that he can make that clearer. My honourable friend, the member for North East Bedfordshire, said we can't do it the same old way, and he's absolutely right. Scrutiny mechanisms are there, and they should be used by the government, but our constituents won't accept warring factions, and that's what the honourable member for Edgbaston was right about. Scoring points is not going to win this. Our strongest position is to be united.
Mr. Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a delight to follow the honourable member, and I like her. Well, not only was I a Remainer, I am a Remainer, and I'll remain a Remainer until my dying day. I want to make first a constituency point, which is that last Friday I visited a business just outside my own constituency in Llantrisant, Marks International. They're a high-tech company. They're now worth about £15 million a year of turnover. They started with 2 people less than 20 years ago, and now they have 120. They make mass spectrometers and thermal desorption things, which I didn't really understand. But it's all very technical, and it's precisely the kind of business, high-end business, that we really want to prosper in this country. And they made 2 points to me. The first was they are really worried about staff recruitment, because a lot of the people that they recruit are at PhD level. And they're worried that if we simply go over, under Brexit, if we simply go over to having the same arrangements for EU people coming to this country as non-EU, as presently exist for non-EU people, then they will find it phenomenally difficult to continue recruiting in the way that they have, and able therefore to grow the company. And that's in particular because if you're only here for 5 years on a short-term deal, It's very difficult to get a mortgage in this country at the moment, and that makes it much more difficult for people in areas such as mine in South Wales, where there's not much of a rental market for people at that kind of level, for people then to think that it's an option to come and move to this country. And secondly, they are passionately concerned to stay in the single market as members of the single market because they want to have full access as members of all the organisations that establish the technical standards for the things that they make. Because otherwise they're absolutely certain that the Germans and the French and the Italians will make sure that they're made in a way that German, French and Italian companies make them and that we don't. And the anxiety for them is that what they will have to do if this goes wrong is that in 2 years' time they will simply have to move all their business to Germany. That's what they will have to do to be able to continue growing the company. And that will be an enormous loss to my local economy. Yes, okay.
I very much agree with the points that he's making. Isn't it also the case that manufacturing of that kind is integrated across the EU? There's an integrated EU supply chain, and if the UK isn't part of that, that's another reason why a lot of jobs will be lost.
It's an extremely well point, and also, in fact, in relation to educational, quite often it's Europe that's been enabling these people to think of opportunities in the UK because of the cross-border cooperation in relation to education and research skills. I want to move on, though, Mr. Speaker, if it's all right, to talk about the process, because I believe that the government will have to take the 48% with us. It will not be good enough if at the end of this process, when we leave, it's still only 52% of the people in this country who think that we've made the right decision, because that will be a recipe for future disaster and lack of confidence in this country. I'd also say to the government, I've never believed the royal prerogative to be absolute. I thought we fought wars about this, quite a lot of wars about this. In fact, it's specifically in relation to even going to war. I believe that the royal prerogative barely now exists. You could argue that following the War of American Independence, when this House decided that we would stop the war rather than the government, we already abandoned the royal prerogative in relation to war-making powers in 1782. On the 22nd of February, but I would argue that in recent years it's become absolutely established now that we will not send troops to war except in extreme situations without the permission and say-so of Parliament. And indeed, I would say that Mr Cameron and Mr Hague explicitly agreed as much when they lost the vote on Syria in this House and decided not to proceed with the action that they'd intended. So the prerogative is not absolute in relation to war, and it's certainly not absolute in relation to treaty making. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, only managed to get through in the end. They had to take it through Parliament. It only got through the House of Lords because, of course, the Queen was persuaded to introduce an extra 12 members of the House of Lords. Now, I know the government is increasing the numbers of the House of Lords very rapidly, but I hope that that's not what they're going to do again. Of course.
Very capable and widely acknowledged historian of this House. He knows that treaties were always, under any kind of Lockean or mixed constitution thinking, treaties were always matters of the federative power, as Locke would say.
Completely and utterly wrong, I'm afraid. The honourable member is also a historian, and doubtless a very impressive one. Now, I've never got round to reading any of his books, but yet, I'm sure in my present retirement that this will now come to me. But the point is that actually, ever since 1924, under the Ponsonby Rule, it's been absolutely clear that all treaties will be laid before both houses, and if either house were to choose to vote it down, then they would not proceed. So I don't think that even in relation to treaties that the government's argument stands. I just want to talk about the timing, Mr Speaker, because the government seems to anticipate that we will be leaving the European Union at the very latest on the 1st of April 2019. I would argue for that to happen, let's work backwards. Any new domestic legislation as a result of the negotiations would need royal assent, I would think, at least 6 months before that, so as to be able to be implemented in law around the country. That means that a treaty bill implementing the negotiations would have to start in this House or in the other place at least 12 months before the 1st of April 2019, i.e. at least the 1st of April 2018, which would normally be in the previous session. I don't think their lordships would like such a bill to have carryover, so you may well have to have a 2-year session of Parliament, 2017-2018. Finally, I just say, I will die trying to persuade people that we will be better off in the European Union, but it doesn't mean I intend to stand in the way of the will of the British people.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologise that my duties as Chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee meant I had to be absent from a part of this debate. Mr. Speaker, I greatly welcome this debate, and I also entirely welcome the motion that was tabled to precipitate it, and I agree with its content. I might add that I also agree with the amendment, which seems to me to be perfectly complementary to the original motion. And I'm particularly pleased that that appears to show a sign of the government moving on this issue in terms of parliamentary involvement, and I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. I also, Mr. Speaker, entirely accept the verdict of the electorate as given on the 23rd of June. It was a significant majority, albeit a small one, but 1,200,000 people is not negligible. And it is our duty as parliamentarians to try to put that into effect. But in doing so, we also as parliamentarians, and indeed in government, have to have regard, as we always do, to the security of our country, to the economic well-being of its citizens, and to their quality of life. And the test for us is how we are going to reconcile the one with the other. I was concerned to listen to my honourable friend, the member for Stafford and Stone, suggest, as I've heard previously, that the result of the referendum provides a restricted number of choices as to what we can now do. It is perfectly plain it does no such thing. We have to leave the EU. The range of those choices thereafter in terms of our relationship with the EU runs from a relationship akin to that of Norway to, I suppose, one akin to that of North Korea, if we were minded to pursue it. I don't have a prescriptive view as to what it should be. I'm quite happy to debate those issues and to listen to colleagues, but what I am not prepared to do, and I say this with emphasis, is to have options closed down by diktat from wherever that may come. And I'm sorry to have to say, whether it be colleagues or the executive on this matter. They will have to be debated in this House, and this House will have to give its approval. And I'm bound to point out that it was Parliament that decided on the referendum, not the executive. It's our task to honour its terms, even if it's the executive's task to implement and, the negotiating process. I also worry very much at the excessive euphoria that has followed this process. I have to say, I hope I'm not too gloomy, but I see it as fraught with risk. There's the risk of the economic damage commented on by my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, and I won't pursue that. I have to say, as a lawyer, I see the repeal process and our leaving as being a legal nightmare, one that is going to take up an endless amount of this House's time and to the prejudice of many of the other priorities on which we should be focused. It undoubtedly impinges on the devolution settlements and competence. We have a duty to maintain legal certainty and the rule of law, which will be jeopardised in the process. There are private legal rights that are likely to be affected, some of which may lead to litigation and claims for compensation. Our international legal obligations are engaged, particularly with the Irish Republic, and that is a matter of vital national interest. And surrounding all that is the fact of the risk of this process being exploited by other countries with inimical interests to those of the United Kingdom, ranging from Russia, which is a predatory state and an international disturber, to the Spanish attitude to Gibraltar, which is also capable of operating greatly to our prejudice and theirs. These are all matters which we are going to have to discuss.
Speaker, can I say that, like many other members of the House, I'm profoundly worried about the lack of clarity from the government, even though we are all accepting that we're only talking about the principles which will govern negotiations in the future. This is a momentous decision, and really the House needs to understand and debate the principles which are lying behind the actions before us. I wanted to make two specific points. The first relates to Article 50. It seems pretty clear that the negotiations will not have been concluded within the 2 years stipulated under Article 50, and therefore we'll have the Great Repeal Act. Now, my understanding is, from what the Brexit Minister said to me on Monday, is that the Great Repeal Act, and I quote him exactly, will put the acquis communautaire straight into British law. Now, the implications of that are quite considerable, because we'll be in a situation whereby Britain will not have concluded its negotiations, but nevertheless, even though we were left the European Union, European law would still apply to us. Yes. And the implications of that are quite huge. For example, if we are no longer under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, will British courts adjudicate on British courts? And if that is the case, how on earth is that going to work possibly in practice? The second question I have to ask is, how long will that situation apply for? How long will European law continue to apply even though we've left the European Union? Is it an open timescale? The second point I want to make is with regard to the situation as it will affect Wales. Wales, like other parts of the United Kingdom, has a devolved administration, and we are largely in receipt of significant amounts of European funds, £1.8 billion from the structural funds, mainly focused on South Wales or West Wales and the valleys for the funding period 2014 to 2020. Now, I understand that the government has said that it will ensure that the monies which have been allocated, even though we leave the European Union, will still be forthcoming after up to 2020. But my question is, the government has also indicated that it intends to change the priorities for expending that money, even though there's a partnership agreement between the European Union and the Welsh Government about how that money is to be spent. The Minister looks quizzical, but that was an explicit commitment given by the Secretary of State for Wales only the other day. And the second question is, given that we are talking about large sums of money involved, isn't it correct, isn't it right, isn't it morally justified, as well as being a legal certainty, that the devolved administrations must have a direct say on the negotiations and the final conclusions which are reached? That is important because we are talking about quite large sums of money, which are important to the peripheral parts of the United Kingdom, but it's also important because when the negotiations have been concluded and when significant powers have been repatriated from Brussels, many of those powers will then be devolved to Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland as part of the devolution package. So it is only reasonable that the full implications of that change is understood, debated and agreed by the devolved institutions themselves. And I would like a commitment from the government that that will be the case. The final point I make is this. I don't think anybody seriously in this House doubts the fact that a clear decision has been taken by the British people. But we want to be absolutely certain that what follows on from that decision is not harmful to the best interests of the British people. That is what we are concerned about, and that is why it is so important for Parliament to have full scrutiny.
Carmichael.
Speaker, first of all, what I'd like to say is I acknowledge the result and I accept its consequences in terms of Britain leaving the European Union, as I would expect other people to have done back in 1975 when we last had a referendum on this subject. The second point I would make is I think it's really critical to recognise that a binary decision of this nature actually opens up so many issues that we've got to think very carefully about all of them. And I'm going to list a few. One, obviously, is the economy. And I think it's really necessary for us to think of some tests that we need to have in our minds during the course of the next 2 years or so. Tests effectively about the value of our pound, about the development of our trade, about the trends in foreign direct investment, about employment characteristics and so on. Because if we don't have those tests, we will lose sight of something very fundamental, which is that the electorate back in June did not vote to become poorer. What they are expecting is in fact something different. And the problem is that clarion calls of hope and confidence, as we've heard today, combined with there's a horizon over there which we will get to, simply won't be enough in terms of setting out our future. So we do have to think carefully about the detail. And anyone connected with the European Scrutiny Committee should know that's exactly what we've been listening to for years. detail about what happens in the European Union. So it cannot be surprising that there must be detail as we leave the European Union. And I think that point needs to be really taken on board. I think the question of the single market is imperative to this argument. It's all very well saying, oh, well, we're going to leave the European Union, so therefore we leave the single market. To leave the world's freest trade area without rhyme or reason would, I think, be verging on an act of national self-harm unless we had some alternative. So we have got to understand the importance of this issue. Now, how do we scrutinise? Well, obviously this Parliament has to. Back in the early 1990s, the Treaty of Maastricht was thoroughly scrutinised, not by some portion of the Parliament, the whole Parliament, and certainly various members who are now suggesting we might not want to be scrutinising things terribly much, were at the forefront of that scrutiny back in the 1990s, and we should remember that. I think that, yes, I'll take a...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would he also agree with me that the issue of how we deal with the single market is fundamental for a very different reason, not just for the sale of goods and how we sell goods, but also for the development and the production of goods, as has been outlined in some early speeches, in terms of how our economies are far more connected in the production of goods too?
Absolutely right. You know, I've said many times in this chamber the importance about free movement, the importance in connection with supply chains and investment and so on, and that is central to the single market argument. And it also reminds me of the important point made earlier by my honourable friend. We have to make sure we've got some friends in the world so that we can actually deal with them later, because we've got risks. The risks with Russia, the risks with other nation states. And I think it's imperative for us to make sure that with the remaining 27 member states of the European Union post-Brexit, we are friendly with them. And the way in which we conduct ourselves is absolutely necessary to build up those friendships, to make sure those bridges are protected and indeed strengthened, because, my goodness, we will need them. This is also about something which my right honourable friend, the member of North East Bedfordshire, correctly pointed out. We have to think about bringing people together. We have to think about this in terms of what kind of nation we are creating post-Brexit and how we are going to present ourselves to the world, because it's not just an internal argument, it is an external process that we are engaged in, and it is not just Europe, it is the rest of the world. And the thing is, if we end up being reliant on the World Trade Organization, there's 163 nation states which will be able to say, aha, we might not let them in. And one or two of those nation states we're busy criticising right now. So we need to think very carefully about our relationships with some of them. So select committees. The Select Committee for Education will be doing a full-scale inquiry in the consequences of Brexit on the university sector, picking up some of the points we've heard about skills. Because one of the reasons the referendum went the way it did was because we do have a mismatch between the skills that we've produced and the skills that we need. And that is actually one of the things which I think my right honourable friend, the member for Grantham and somewhere else, was really referring to, about the reasons why we lost, and we must learn from those reasons and make sure that all of our select committees actually play their part.
I very much agree with what the honourable member for Stroud has just been saying about the risks ahead, existential risk, I think, for the UK economy. A number of speakers in this very helpful, valuable debate have suggested that what the negotiations should be aiming for is, on the one hand, barrier-free access to the single market, to use the Secretary of State's phrase, and on the other, no longer to apply the current free movement rules in terms of people coming to the UK. And I agree with that. I think that is the objective we should be setting. I hope it'll be set out and developed, and we'll have the chance to vote on it before Article 50 is invoked. A number of us took part in an all-party visit to Germany last month. My honourable friends for Wrexham and for Scunthorpe were there. The honourable member for Monmouth was there from the Conservative benches for the Leave campaign. We met businesses, politicians, civil servants, and they all wanted to talk to us about Britain's departure from the EU. They told us that they were great admirers of Britain. They said to us that Germany would be Britain's best ally in the EU as these negotiations go forward. They're very sorry that we're leaving, but they accept that we are. So we said to them, so if the British government comes to Brussels and asks for barrier-free access to the single market, no longer to apply free movement, would Germany argue for that settlement? And they said no, Germany wouldn't. And the reason is that to do so would be to invite many other European countries who don't like some bit or other of the 4 pillars of the European Union also to come forward with requests to opt out of that bit, and the result would be an unwinding of the European Union. That would not be in the interests of Germany or of German manufacturers, and that's why I think the Right Honourable Member for Workingham is wrong to suggest that because lots of German cars are sold to the UK, we will readily get barrier-free access to the single market. I don't think we will. I think it'll be a difficult negotiation. And for much of our discussion in Germany, it was very difficult to see any glimmer of a resolution that would allow us to continue to trade in the way that we do. But then we finally had a meeting with Dr. Markus Kerber, who's the Director General of the Federation of German Industries, the BDI, the equivalent of the CBI. And he suggested to us one possibility, which was it might be possible to redefine free movement so that it only would apply to people with a contract of employment in the UK or something very close to a contract for employment. And arguably, that's what free movement always meant. It is supposed to be free movement of labour, not free movement of anybody. And he suggested it might be possible to persuade the other member states in the EU to change the meaning of free movement in that way, so that pillar amongst the 4 pillars would remain in place, but it would mean something rather different in the case of the UK, and that it might be possible to negotiate barrier-free access to the single market if that was done. Now, clearly, that's an idea that would need a great deal of work, but there may at least be a glimmer there of something that could be delivered that would avoid what otherwise seem to me to be very, very serious threats for the future of the UK economy. Manufacturing across Europe is integrated, aerospace, cars. If, as the Right Honourable Member for Workingham suggested, we start trying to impose tariffs on sub-assemblies made in one country before they come to the UK to be turned into a car, then that is an impossible position for manufacturers. Financial services, great risks as well. I hope that that might be a way forward for ministers to consider.
Mr. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman for East Ham, who, as usual, has made an extremely impressive speech, and I would agree with every word he says. I would like, Mr. Speaker, to say that I think there are 2 opportunities which come out of this process, and they've been alluded to. The first is in the tone in which we conduct it, and I think most speeches today have been very much in that constructive tone, and I would agree with the Honourable Member for Glasgow South that I wish we would adopt that same constructive tone towards talk about Scotland, because I believe that's a much better way of approaching than the way that some of us have done in the past. And secondly, in relation to our European Union partners, my honourable friend for Stroud said we have to create excellent relationships with them. We have to build on the relationships we have already. That is absolutely vital. But the second opportunity, and this was something mentioned to me when I was in Washington last week for the meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, is we have an opportunity in a world where actually there's a great threat to the global economy. In the meetings last week, they were the most downbeat that I've ever heard for a very long time, not just about Brexit, the downturn in the Chinese economy, and many other facts. We have the opportunity to make this a chance to stress the importance of interacting with the world, if you like, in praise, I don't like the word globalisation, but internationalisation, of working, of encouraging trade, of reducing barriers. This is an opportunity to do that. It's an opportunity. We could shirk it and retreat, or we could say, let's use this as an opportunity to show that it can be done in a positive and reaching out manner. I'd just like to make a couple of comments about content. I know this is supposed to be about scrutiny, but about content I think is equally important, because we don't have much time. I mean, March next year is less than 6 months away. So, in addition to agreeing with the Right Honourable Member and others for, about the fullest possible access and, if possible, being part of the single market, I would mention two things from my experience, long experience in working in selling into the EU from outside the EU over more than 2 decades. The first is it's not just about tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers are sometimes worse than tariff barriers. And we can have tariff-free access and then find that actually you've got to export all your cars through a small port that doesn't have the capacity to import them. So we must watch out for that. And the second, as a number of people have already mentioned, and the Honourable Member for Birmingham Erdington pointed out in the context of Jaguar Land Rover, is supply chains. Supply chains are absolutely vital for aerospace, for manufacturing, for car manufacturing. We must make sure those supply chains are not impeded by paperwork, by tariffs, whatever. That must be absolutely at the forefront of negotiations. And just finally, a word about services. It's absolutely right that we focus a lot on manufacturing, but services are critical. They are well over 80% of our economy. We have a surplus in exports of services to the European Union. We must absolutely focus on that and ensure we have the best possible environment for both exporting services and engaging in providing services throughout the European Union and elsewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on defence of free movement of people and to ask the government why they are so recklessly turning any consideration of what it brings, forgetting any consideration of what it brings and casting it aside, and particularly to ask them if they will consider the impact on whether or not we can be part of the single European market. Like my honourable friend, the Honourable Member for Rhondda, I will be a Remainer till I die, and I passionately believe in the value that being part of the European Union, with all its flaws, but all its many, many benefits, brings to us. But I was also particularly inspired to hear the Honourable Member, the Honourable Lady for Broxtowe, speak so passionately and eloquently also in favour of free movement of people. In Bristol West, Mr. Speaker, people voted overwhelmingly for Remain. It was close to 80%. And they have asked me to speak on their behalf, to hang on to everything that's good about the European Union for as long as we possibly can. And they have particularly asked me to speak out in favour of free movement of people. And first of all, before I say any more, I want to say to all those EU citizens living and working and contributing to the life of Bristol, those working in the health service, in the hospitals, in the universities, in our tech industries and in the creative industries, not displacing other people, British people from jobs, but sharing their knowledge, transferring their skills and working in a reciprocal way whereby UK citizens also go and travel to the European Union and share their skills. I want to say to all those EU citizens in Bristol right now, we welcome you, we value you, and we want you to stay. And I believe that there are many others who feel the same way about EU citizens in their constituencies. The risks of giving up free movement of people are profound, but I want to speak first and briefly about the benefits. Which of us, we have been presented with free movement of people as if it was something that were done to us, instead of something about which we also have options, in which we also participate. Which of us does not want for our sons and daughters, our nephews and nieces, to have the choice whether or not they live, work, study or travel around the European Union? So many of the young people, 80% some people have said, 70–80% of young people voted for Remain, but I'm also thinking about the 16 and 17-year-olds who were denied by the government the right to vote in this referendum, who have told me that they feel betrayed by the older generation and the opportunities that they have been robbed of. I'm thinking also of the apprentices in Airbus, who are at the moment able to move between different sites in the aerospace industry across Europe. I'm thinking also of the musicians who currently can tour around the European Union. Will they be required to have separate visas for each of the 27 countries, separate entry regulations for all their equipment? But the risks of giving it up, the risks for us are profound. I've been told by tech industries, by the university and by creative industries in my constituency that they are already being cut out of applications to the Horizon 2020 Research and Development Fund. Now, this is no small matter. It's not just a matter of money, it's a matter of knowledge, it's a matter of improving our economy, it's a matter of our future, and it's a matter of jobs, Mr. Speaker. So finally, I must say, if the government wants to jettison all of this, the Secretary of State should at least have had the courtesy to inform the British people what they are risking, and they should at least respect the sovereignty of this Parliament, the sovereignty that Brexit campaign has made so much of. Does the Secretary of State really want to throw all that away? Because it's clear to me that it means that they have no plan for the future of this country if they throw it away without debate, without proper scrutiny and without the full participation of the British people. My constituents and the country will never forgive them for doing this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mike Wood.
Mr. Speaker, Parliament must have a role, whether through select committees or in this chamber, in the general terms for negotiations, and that's why I support the motion this evening, and why I also welcome the principles laid out by the Secretary of State earlier this afternoon. However, it would clearly be counterproductive to restrict the government's scope to negotiate the best deal for Britain. If we attempt to set some form of specific mandate, then we find ourselves choosing between two equally unattractive outcomes. The government could do what Tony Blair did in 2004, ahead of the European Constitution negotiations, set out a series of so-called red lines that are either so vague as to be meaningless or so much part of the consensus that they're unlikely to be challenged. Or the government could set out something more detailed, setting out what the UK would and would not accept, but risk destroying our negotiating position. These negotiations aren't a matter of simple binary questions for us to choose between: hard Brexit, soft Brexit, in the internal market or no access to it, open or sealed borders. These may be easy slogans, but they mean very little. Brexit means exactly what was on the ballot paper in June. Britain will not remain a member of the European Union. But everybody, including a lot of the speeches this afternoon, seems to have a rather different idea of what they mean by particularly the single market. We heard a number of particularly opposition Labour backbenchers say we must remain members of the internal market. The shadow Brexit secretary spoke about having to have access to the single market, and the honourable gentleman for Erdington focused rather more on zero tariffs, particularly for manufactured goods. I spent 7 years working in the European Parliament, most of it on internal market policy, but I don't recognise this distinct, clearly defined single market that we're being asked to stay in. If it means Britain remaining within the EEA as it's currently set up, then it's hard to see how that's compatible with the tone of this summer's debate or with the vote in June. The internal market is the four freedoms of movement. You can no longer be a member of the internal market without freedom of movement of people. Then you can demand a pound of flesh without shedding a jot of blood. If not that, what does single market access mean? Does it mean the ability to simply the ability to trade with EU countries? If so, then presumably almost every country in the world has access. Does it mean zero tariffs, as the honourable gentleman suggested? If so, that can and should be done. Trade barriers damage everybody. Does it mean being able to provide a service in any EU country on the same basis that you could in your home country, Well, 10 years on from the EU Services Directive, frankly, the EU doesn't have that yet. And so I certainly hope that the government will address this in new agreements both with the EU and also with countries outside the European Union, because Britain should be an open trading nation. I believe we can make a success of that outside of the EU. Of course, Parliament has a role in scrutinising what comes next, but we should also all be clear, Britain will be leaving the European Union and we will be successful.
There have been many passionate speeches today about Parliament's role in holding the government to account for its Brexit decisions in the months and years ahead. But I think we've also got to focus on what's happening in the here and now. This morning, the Bank of England released data showing sterling has reached an historic 168-year low. The pound is now worth less than it was in the 1976 sterling crisis, when the IMF had to bail us out, in the aftermath of Black Wednesday, when sterling left the ERM, and at the height of the financial crisis in 2008. Sterling goes up and down, and foreign exchange markets aren't always the most reliable measure of what's really happening in our economy. But when currency markets move so sharply and for a significant period of time, the government should pay attention. Yet so far, ministers have not. The pound has fallen by around 20% over the last year. About half of this drop happened well after the referendum result, as the government's position on Brexit began to take shape. The moves we've seen in the currency markets are backed by billions of dollars. And what the markets are saying is that UK domestic assets now look less valuable, that the UK seems a less attractive country in which to invest, and that the UK's growth prospects look set to be weaker. Now, the fall in sterling really matters to every single household in the UK. It is not just that foreign holidays are more expensive, it's that the costs of everyday goods that are made abroad, like food, fuel and clothes, are rising too. British households are more dependent on imports than before, with imports now representing around 30% of our GDP. The pound in people's pockets has been devalued, and if prices rise faster than wages, then people will be poorer. Now, it may be that a devaluation in sterling will make our exports more competitive. If exports rise and imports fall, our large trade deficit could decrease, helping to rebalance our economy. But this has not happened after previous sterling crises, at least not on a lasting basis. And an improvement in Britain's trade position may be even harder to achieve now if Brexit reduces access to the EU single market and alternative export markets take years to open up. There is another important consequence of the falling pound, which has so far received far too little attention. In her recent party conference speech, the Prime Minister said that whilst monetary policy has provided the necessary emergency medicine after the financial crisis, super low interest rates and quantitative easing have had some bad side effects. People with assets have become richer, but those without have suffered. People with mortgages have found their debts are cheaper, but those with savings have found themselves poorer. But what the Prime Minister has failed to recognise is that the falling pound is yet again benefiting the asset-rich. Shareholders in FTSE 100 companies, which make most of their profits abroad, all those with foreign assets, have seen yet another extraordinary windfall. But whilst the already asset-rich benefit from the falling pound, the asset-poor suffer as costs rise as everyday goods imported from abroad go up. Mr. Speaker, the government rightly intends to respect the will of the people and do their best to make Brexit work, as do I. But they must recognise that the falling pound means the British people could become poorer than they were before the referendum, at exactly the same time as real incomes have finally started to recover from the sharp squeeze after the financial crisis. The government must acknowledge this and act if they want to make good on their promise of an economy that works for all, not just a few at the top.
Ian C. Lucas.
I'm one of those
members of Parliament who campaigned for a Remain vote but had a constituency which voted 59%, 41% to leave the European Union. And I respect fully the views of my constituents. And adopting the words of the member for Stafford, for whom I have great respect, I'm going to try to be constructive. And I think it's very important that we make clear that we will be leaving the European Union, and we now need to engage with our constituents on the difficult issues that we need to face. Now, the central concern of my constituents related to the immigration rules which apply to EU citizens moving to the UK. And they did not like them, and they want the rules which we currently have to be changed. I was very struck by the excellent speech by my honourable friend from Bristol West, who talked about freedom of movement and was passionate in advocating it. But the reality is, we do not have freedom of movement in this country. We only have freedom of movement within the European Union. There are rules that apply to people who are not members, who are not citizens of EU states, which are currently in place and which we apply on a daily basis. So we have to be clear that there will be rules in the future which apply to EU citizens, and some of those rules are going to be very similar to the rules which apply to non-EU citizens today. If there was a proposal by anyone to have full freedom of movement to the UK, then I suspect that most members of this House would disagree with that as an approach. The difficulty that we have with the government's present position is that it is being so vague and so evasive about what its current position is. Now, I intervened on the Secretary of State earlier, and I asked him to set out to this House the principles which are going to govern the rules which apply to EU citizens. And he didn't do so, and he hasn't done so in any of the statements that have applied, that he has made to this House. And it is absolutely imperative that the government start to be explicit in setting out the principles which will govern the way that individuals come to the UK when we leave the European Union. This is not a theoretical question. I was speaking last Friday. The honourable gentleman knows that Airbus is very close to my constituency. I spoke to a Portuguese and a Spanish apprentice, and both of them asked me, will I be allowed to remain in the UK even as an employee of Airbus for the future? Early this afternoon, in connection with my Select Committee role on the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, I spoke to a company which is involved in the creative industries and was wanting to know about the position of its employees with offices in the United States, in Berlin and in the UK. These are explicit and real questions today. Now, I welcome the progress the government has made towards giving more information about its position, but it's going to come under relentless pressure, not just from members of this House, but also from business and from individuals to make clear its position. I was very struck by the excellent speech, I never thought I'd say this, from the Right Honourable Member from Sheffield Hallam, who said that he explicitly set out the position, or the Prime Minister explicitly set out the position relating to justice reforms before negotiations were conducted. That's what the government is going to have to do. Shake.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. There can be no other issue in this country's modern history which demands more serious scrutiny, more well-drafted legislation or forensic budgetary oversight than the proposal for the UK to leave the EU. So I welcome today's motion. But despite the apparent climb down on the issue overnight, the Prime Minister still appeared reluctant earlier today to confirm that Parliament is at the centre of this process. Mr. Speaker, in the Prime Minister's speech to the Scottish Conservatives Conference prior to the independence referendum in 2014, she outlined, I quote, "a future in which Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England continue to flourish side by side as equal partners." We need to see this in action. Several members of the Cabinet have now stated that there shouldn't be a running commentary on their plans. Plans which had been costed by Her Majesty's Treasury to potentially cost the Exchequer £66 billion per annum, almost 10% of the UK's tax revenues. They've implored us to trust them, Mr Speaker, while they negotiate on our behalf. Trust them. Should we trust the Foreign Secretary to get us the best deal when the Prime Minister herself doesn't have faith in him? On June the 26th, he wrote of a points-based immigration system that suits the needs of business and industry. Not so, says the Prime Minister. On September the 5th, the spokeswoman for the PM put him back in his place, stating a points-based system will not work and is not an option. Should we then trust the judgment of the Secretary of State for International Trade, when the Prime Minister clearly doesn't? On his very first trip to the USA following his reappointment, he said the government would likely seek a free trade agreement with the EU rather than a closer customs union. By the end of the day, Downing Street was again forced to clarify comments, stating that no decision had been made on whether Britain would seek to be part of the EU customs union. And what about the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union? Can we take his statements at face value? He came to this House and told us last month this government is looking at every option, but the simple truth that if a requirement of membership is giving up control of our borders, I think that makes it very improbable. 24 hours later, Downing Street responds, "Not so fast," says the PM spokeswoman. Asked if the Secretary of State was expressing a government policy, she said, "He's setting out his opinion. A policy tends to be a direction of travel. Saying something is probable or improbable is not policy." Mr Speaker, if we can't take the public statements of Cabinet Secretaries at face value, if we know that we have to double-check the views of senior ministers against official government policy, which we do, and if the record shows that even the Prime Minister who personally appointed these people to post does not agree with them on key areas of policy which underpin these vital negotiations, how can we trust this government to get a good deal from this process? They don't even trust each other. Yeah. And it's because of this fundamental point that Parliament, indeed all parliaments across these islands, must play a central role in scrutinising and providing democratic oversight of this process. So let's hear from the Secretary of State today, Mr Speaker, that Scotland will be firmly embedded in the UK's process of developing its negotiating strategy. Brexit means Brexit doesn't cut it. It doesn't cut it at home and it doesn't cut it abroad, where internationally people are looking on and wondering how a government of a country, one that claims to have the mother of all parliaments, could be so woefully unprepared for the result it has in its hands.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise, like other colleagues here today, as someone who fought to remain but who accepts the result because on Teesside, every single one of our boroughs voted to leave the EU by more than 60%. Our constituents sent a clear message to Westminster that the current social, economic and political settlement is not working for them and they wanted to see change. We must hear it loud and clear, and now we and the government must ensure that their concerns are met and that the negotiations from Brexit work for them. However, whilst the message from the country to leave the EU was clear, the terms of Brexit were not on the ballot paper. And it is therefore vital, as the motion today says, that Parliament plays a key role in the exit negotiations going forward. The people of Teesside voted for Brexit, but they did not vote to give the government a blank cheque to negotiate away their jobs, their rights and their security. As the discussion we've had today has shown, there are many reasons behind the decisions that people made to vote in the EU referendum. But many people that I spoke to voted to leave because they were angry about the loss of our steelworks last year. And they believed the government when they hid behind untrue claims that they couldn't intervene due to EU state aid rules and that they couldn't tackle Chinese dumping due to EU tariff rules. So, now that we've been liberated to drive our own industrial strategy, they're looking to the government to protect British industry and manufacturing. But what do we see? We see a leading Brexit minister, the Secretary of State for International Trade, who has said that the government, quote, must turn our back on voices that tell us it's okay to protect bits of your industry, and who also urged the government, I quote again, to be unreconstructed, unapologetic free traders. So, no protection for our vital industry in crisis, and another premise on which my constituents voted swept away. Such a laissez-faire approach would have serious consequences for the UK steel industry, which has suffered from a flood of cheap Chinese steel. My constituents who voted for Brexit wanted an active interventionist government working to support British industry. Will the government commit to ensuring vital British industries will be defended when we are outside the EU against unfair, state-sponsored competition from abroad? And will they promise that we in this House will get to debate these vital trade deals and tariffs, which will have a huge impact on British industry? Moreover, thanks to this government's failure on steel, we on Teesside have a huge task to rebuild our local economy. It is vital that Brexit empowers our region and allows us to attract the inward investment we need to bring new businesses and industries to the area, creating the decent, secure and well-paid jobs we desperately need. Our two major assets on Teesside, which will be vital to our economic recovery, are Teesport and Wilton International. Both benefit hugely from access to the European single market, and maintaining this access must be a key part of Britain's Brexit deal. A hard Brexit without trade agreements in place to ensure Teesside's businesses can continue to trade freely would be potentially disastrous for our area and threaten many thousands more jobs. And what's more, our Tees Valley devolution deal with the government was also underpinned by access to EU funding. Will the government confirm these funding pots will be maintained going forward? Regional development funding has made a huge impact, supporting growth, innovation, upskilling and job creation in our region. We must continue to receive the support for Teesside's economy to grow. So, Mr Speaker, we have to make the most of the opportunities provided by Brexit, and I urge the government to ensure that it helps, rather than hinders, areas like Teesside. We in Parliament, as representatives of our towns, cities and communities who will be deeply affected by these Brexit negotiations, must have a role to ensure that.
Ben James. Speaker, can I welcome this debate, but can I also agree with my right honourable friend from Wolverhampton South East when he said it's rather sad that anyone who is scrutinising or asking for scrutiny of the government's strategy or lack of it is being accused of wanting to reverse the decision of the 23rd of June. Can I make it clear that it's clearly not my position? Can I say to the honourable member for New Forest West, what it means for me is that there is no going back. There is no second referendum. There is no deals to try and keep us in the EU by the back door. And I agree with the Secretary of State for Brexit, who spoke on Monday, when he said that the mandate for Britain to leave the EU is clear and unarguable. But yes, I agree with that. But that vote did not give the government a roadmap or a vision of what post-Brexit Britain will look like. We do now need to get the best deal. It is our duty as members of Parliament elected this House to get the best deal possible for our constituents, to protect their interests and also their livelihoods. It also is not fair, I don't think, over the next few years, just to sit back and ignore what the government is doing. I agree totally with my honourable friend from Leicester West when she argues about the issue of the pound. We've had loose talk from ministers over the last few weeks, costing people's not only jobs, but also costing people's livelihoods as well. What we need now from the government isn't the slogan Brexit means Brexit and everything else. What we need is a clear framework of what the process is going to be, but also what the vision is about what they see a post-Brexit Britain looking like. Instead, what we've got a Prime Minister who, throughout the referendum campaign, claimed to be arguing for in, but was quiet as a church mouse, who is now also arguing stridently that the most key issue is control of immigration. This is the same person who then sits there and stands, and for the last 6 years has had the job of controlling immigration, and stands back as though it's nothing to do with her now. We also have had the worst types of dog whistle politics at the last week's Conservative conference, pandering to people's prejudice rather than actually putting forward alternatives and strategies for what is in the best interest of it. The Prime Minister is reverted to type. She's trying to rise above this, hiding behind the Brexit practice and leaving it to three Brexiteers. Well, we have the Foreign Secretary who gambled on making sure that he would hitch his bandwagon to the Brexit bandwagon, hoping that the British government, British people wouldn't support it, and now floundering what to do. We have the Secretary of State for International Trade, whose ideology and vision for this country is more akin to Republican Tea Party politics, what I think most of this country would want. And we have the member for Brexit, who was the champion from the backbenches of this House's sovereign rights, now doing the greatest act of a poacher-turned gamekeeper. And he has spoken twice in statements to the House, and he spoke again today. Any illumination of what the government strategy is? No, none at all. More power, actually, out of a 40-watt light bulb than what we've had from the decisions that are coming forward now for this country are not only going to affect people today, it's going to affect this country for generations. We have a duty, Mr Speaker, as parliamentarians, to ensure that we get the best deal possibly for our constituents, but also to ensure that we have the tolerant, respectful country, which I think is some of the best parts of being a member of the British United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, when we debated the Psychoactive Substances Act, Brexit was not listed as a mind-altering substance, but it clearly is, because it has completely transformed the view and completely changed the character of the Secretary of State and many of his colleagues in relation to the primacy of Parliament and in terms of his disdain or concern about use of the royal prerogative. And of course, we've also heard yet again that the Secretary of State was here with us yet again at the dispatch box. But of course we were told by the Prime Minister there would be no running commentary on these negotiations, and that's the risk of this motion supposedly. But the fact is we are being treated again and again to something that is almost like a schoolboy vocalising his own fantasy commentary as he dribbles around the dispatch box. The fact is we as a Parliament have the right and the duty to make sure that we best consider how these matters are taken forward. In circumstances where we have a government that is surprised to now be the government, after a former government that was surprised with the result, the idea that Parliament has no role whatsoever and can just trust this entirely to the royal prerogative, to the three egos, because there's certainly not three amigos that are meant to be leading in these situations. It is an absolute request that we would commit a dereliction of duty. Like other honourable members, yes, I'm quite open. I voted for Remain. I'm also very glad to report that my constituency voted overwhelmingly, over 78%, to Remain, as did the people of Northern Ireland by over 56%. And in Northern Ireland, it's a place where many of us have worked hard over many years to establish the principle of consent as the core basis for our working institutions. But more of that shortly. But can the government not see that there may be an opportunity, by allowing better parliamentary input and even allowing a vote before Article 50, to maximise the confidence that there is in how things are going forward, and to answer the sort of criticisms that they will meet from people in other governments and in European Commission and European Parliament who will have their own commentary on how the referendum was conducted and what it means, if they're able to say that their negotiating position actually has been proofed and approved by this Parliament. It actually would strengthen the negotiating position of the government rather than saying that they would be weakened in any way. And let's remember, even today, the Secretary of State listed a whole number of sectors and interest groups that are worried, have real worries, and we know what many of them are in respect of free movement, in respect of the single market, in respect of funding and research collaboration. And the fact is that we can't just say to all those people, well, we'll find out after the break. We need to be answering those questions, and we as a Parliament need to be asking these questions. The Great Repeal Bill doesn't satisfy it, because after all, others have called it the Great Entrenchment Bill or the Great Incorporation Bill. It's really a great download and save bill, where we will just be downloading and saving all the existing European law. But of course there will then be the power to delete, and there's going to be a key question. Who will have that power to delete? Will it be that any changes and amendments have to be put through here in primary legislation through Parliament, or is it going to be ministers will use their power by order to make these changes, because we will then have a fit of ministerial joyriding as they do different damage, or maybe to be more current, there's going to be clowns with chainsaws as they run through a whole list of European legal protections in respect of the environment and on workers' rights. And the idea that we can say, oh no, it's okay, it'll be the royal prerogative for now, but we'll all be in control after that and there'll be true parliamentary accountability after that, we cannot go. We cannot subscribe to this outrageous arrogance of the government at this time. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I do want to say that in respect of the position of the Good Friday Agreement, government needs to stop just going on about the question of the hard or soft border or consulting the executive, and they need to say specifically, is the provisions in Annex A of the Good Friday Agreement in respect of the opportunity for United Ireland and in Schedule 1 of the 98 Act, are they going to be specifically written into a UK-EU treaty? Because they will have to be.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a passionate pro-European. I campaigned very hard for the Remain cause, and in common with my fellow Black Country representatives and constituencies, they voted something like 2-1 to leave. I would ignore that result at my peril and would not disrespect it anyway. However, I also represent a constituency that has more foundries in it than any other in the United Kingdom.
They are closely integrated into the automotive and civil aviation supply chain that not only depends on the single market for to sell its product, but also is part of a highly integrated process that also depends on being part of a single market. And the dilemma that I have, and actually I think to a certain extent is reflected with the challenge of the government, is how do you reconcile the very genuine fears of the public with the needs of those who are working in these industries and who are dependent on their success, which in turn is dependent on the single market. Now, if I remember the campaigns, the comments made by the former Prime Minister when debating about Europe in previous governments, whilst he was keen to criticise the EU for all sorts of reasons and domestic political reasons, he was also adamant that remaining part of the single market was very important to the future of this country. And when I campaigned during the referendum campaign, there was an argument peddled by the Leavers that Britain was so important to the EU in its trading relations that no EU country or the EU would not dare to insist that we left the single market. And I had some private sympathy with that argument as well. And I think once the initial shock of us leaving and the adverse immediate economic reaction, both business and the economy recovered, because instinctively almost, and the mood music was that that would be the situation. What changed, unfortunately, and the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Rushcliffe, I think, explained this, was the comments made by ministers at the Tory party conference, which, having said that they were not going to spell out their negotiating position to this chamber in September, then went to the Tory party conference and actually took what appeared to be very hard public positions on the future negotiating stance in the EU, which completely changed the balance of business and public perception of what the approach would be. The priority came across that it was immigration, 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 and not single market. The reaction of business, no, I'm not taking it into it. The reaction of businesses, higher education, and the market, reflecting since then, has caused us potentially huge problems. And this is why I think it underlines the need for the Minister for Brexit to reverse his previous position, come to this House and spell out priorities which will emphasise and underline our commitment as a chamber here to being part of that single market. Because without it, we could actually go into negotiations with our negotiating parties thinking we're not.
Brexit might mean Brexit, but what does it really mean? A different thing to everyone. Like beauty, it is very much in the eye of the beholder. One thing is absolutely clear, however. The EU referendum was a shout out to be listened to, for the British people no longer to be patronised and ignored. So for the British government to say they know what the British people mean by Brexit is to betray the same patronising, arrogant, distant, know-it-all attitude that the EU vote was railing against. Justly ironic. As the member for North East Bedfordshire said in an excellent contribution, we have a duty to take people with us. Our duty is to listen to what real people say. Confusing and contradictory as it might be, but maybe it is very real. The local farmer who said to me he voted Leave but desperately wants to retain freedom of movement. The local businessman who said to me he voted Leave but wants to retain full access to the single market. The local grandmother who said to me she voted Leave but wants her grandchildren to enjoy the freedoms and peace of the last 60 years in their future. The local steelworker who said to me he voted Leave because he thought that would give us more protection for the steel industry. But as we've heard from my honourable friend for Redcar, that is put at risk by the statements of the Secretary of State for International Trade. The reality, Mr Speaker, is more contradictory and nuanced than the Europhobes would have us believe. People want to come out, but they don't want to lose out. For all their healthy scepticism and doubt about their politicians, us, they have high expectations of us. They expect us to marry these contradictions and to square the circle in their interests, and that's our overwhelming responsibility. That doesn't mean rushing headlong for a hard Brexit in some vainglorious, jingoistic charge of the Light Brigade, damaging our country and our people. We, the sovereign Parliament of this United Kingdom, must listen to all our citizens, the 48% who voted Remain, as well as the 52% who voted Leave, the 65% of eligible voters who didn't vote Leave, as well as the 35% who did. We must deliver Brexit in a way which delivers for the people. Standing in front of a full class of 16 and 17-year-olds at John Leggett College, where I used to be principal last week, the subject turned to the EU referendum, and I asked that class how many of them would have voted Leave, and not one hand went up. And I said, come on, don't be shy, put your hands up. And they said, no, no, we would have all voted Remain. So I said, how many of your parents voted Leave? And half the hands went up. We have an obligation to deliver for those people and those voices who did not vote, as well as those who did. That doesn't mean we overturn the judgment of the British people to leave the European Union, but it means we need to interpret and listen and deliver that in a way that benefits everybody, in a way that benefits us all for the future. Well, I went to... I think that'll do, actually, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Jamie Perkins.
Thank you very much. A great ending. Like my colleagues, I was sort of ambiguously in favour of Britain staying within the EU. However, I accept that we were unable to convince voters of the arguments we're making, and as a Democrat, I firmly believe that having taken the choice to hold the referendum, seeing that referendum cost the Prime Minister his job, there can be no doubt the government should get on with the job of negotiating our exit from the EU. But when we talk about this verdict, it was a very close verdict, and I remember on the night of the poll you were able to get 8-1 against Brexit happening. We had Nigel Farage on the television, wrong again, telling us that Remain was going to win, but also telling us that in the event of Remain winning, we were going to have another referendum. The campaign wasn't over, we were going to have another vote. So we shouldn't remember, we shouldn't forget that many of those people who are now saying we should get on and accept the result were telling us that in the event of a Remain vote, we should have a second referendum. But I do personally regret the instant campaign for a second referendum. The result was legitimate, and whilst it was a close call, I think that those advocating a second referendum on the basis that the British people didn't know what they were voting for are ill-advised. And I think that the thirst to ask people to vote again does undermine that perfectly legitimate demand that we're making for proper debate about what the shape of our future relationship with Europe should look like. Now, whilst I think it's true to say the Leave campaign was vague on the details of what a post-Brexit relationship with Europe and the rest of the world would look like, and whilst many of the campaign promises they made have disappeared like a spring frost in the days since, there were some clear commitments that constituents of mine that voted Leave were clearly understanding. The first of these was that we would be able to continue to trade with Europe. They imported less of our goods than we did of theirs. We were told they're still going to want to sell us their BMWs, but we were also told that pulling out of the EU would open new doors to all these other markets that we were unable to currently access. The second thing that my constituents heard was that there would be a reduction of immigration, that we would take back control of our borders, and they clearly believed and will demand that leaving the European Union would enable Britain to control freedom of movement and to reduce immigration. But I have to say to the government that if they are sending out a message to foreign doctors at this moment when our NHS is so stretched that you may be welcome now, but you might not be in the future, that you can come here, set up home here, have children here, but know that in a few years, if we can train some doctors up, you might all have to go. That is absolute madness. It is madness. Our NHS cannot cope without those doctors and without the other healthcare professionals, and there's many other skills that we rely on from overseas. So if the government are trying to send that message, they are absolutely insane. Thirdly, my constituents expect Britain to be better off as a result of leaving the EU. The 350 million for the NHS may have already disappeared, but whatever the government chooses to spend money on, there is a clear expectation there is going to be more money to be spent in the UK as a result of Brexit. Now, as a Remainer, if the government deliver on those three tests, there will be no need for a second referendum. But what worries me is that this decision is being driven by intra-party concerns within the Tory party, that we have a Prime Minister who rather ambiguously was on the Remain side and is now trying to show a party that is overwhelmingly, in terms of their activists, dominated by people on the Leave side, that she's going to be good to that promise. And so because of that, we've got a very, very hard Brexit proposal being brought forward. And I think it was very revealing that Raoul Ruparel, before joining the Secretary of State for Brexit's team as advisor, said that it is concerning that the UK government still seems to be debating the basic tenets of Brexit when the time is upon us to be drafting a detailed approach. We need that detailed approach, and that's why I support this motion in front of us.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to speak in favour of the motion, which was put down by my honourable and right honourable friends, on the parliamentary scrutiny of the UK leaving the EU. Obviously, we all want Parliament to scrutinise the negotiating strategy before ministers trigger Article 50, but I'm in favour of us having a vote on this as well. Article 50 says that it should be triggered in line with our constitutional arrangements. Well, I think anybody asked what kind of constitution does Britain have would say it's basically a parliamentary democracy. They wouldn't say it's a royal autocracy. They wouldn't say, oh, it's a bit like the Kingdom of Bhutan. And therefore, for the government to choose to use the royal prerogative is to choose to do something which is arcane, undemocratic and secretive, and none of those are conducive to a good deal. The member for North East Somerset, who sadly isn't in his place at the moment, was very confident earlier that because of the standing orders of this House, the government would have to come back. Well, I hope that the government will come back, but at the moment we see no sign of it from ministers or their lawyers. They're still fighting a case to defend the royal prerogative. They're saying compelling the government to introduce legislation would be to trespass on Parliament. When I asked the Secretary of State about this on Monday, he gave a very interesting reply. He said, "The main guidance I gave to the Attorney General was that a would-be vote in this House on Article 50 could have two outcomes. It either lets it through or it stops it. This would be a refusal to implement the decision of the British people." Well, I think the Secretary of State should go back to his original idea of having a white paper, because as many honourable members have said, people voted for Brexit, but they didn't vote how to Brexit. If the Secretary of State followed his initial idea of having a white paper, the government could set out different options for Brexit, call it soft or hard or something more complicated than that would probably be better, and the House could then vote on which Brexit strategy it thought would be best. And this isn't a completely revolutionary new process. It's the process that we used when we voted on House of Lords reform in the last Parliament, and I commend it to ministers. The Leave campaigners voted to restore parliamentary sovereignty and take back control, and I think that's exactly what we should do. I'm extremely concerned about the problems with the Customs Union, and I just want to remind the House that the Customs Union was established in 1968. It's what we joined in 1973. It's what last time we had a referendum in 1975 people voted in favour of. And while it's clear that people have reservations about immigration, they have reservations about European law, they have reservations about the European Court of Justice. Most people actually are in favour of what they call the common market. And I am very keen that one of the options that the government keeps on the table is that we remain within the customs union, because without it we're going to see a huge burden on the 40% of our exports that go to the EU.
Mr. Speaker, firstly, I'm pleased that the government has actually acknowledged in its amendment that it has a negotiating position. This is a major step forward. I'm also pleased that an unelected Prime Minister has deigned to give Parliament in due course an opportunity to discuss this. And it's a real shame that the Prime Minister didn't start off her premiership given this commitment. Instead, she's been forced to capitulate to the reasonable demands of so many people across the House. And the fact that the Prime Minister even gave thought to gagging Parliament, because that's what it was in the first place, is shocking. And if she can't get a major constitutional issue right, what hope is there for the ability to negotiate a deal with the European Union, especially with 3 members of her cabinet leading the charge who can't even agree amongst themselves who is leading on what? And I'm afraid the government isn't even in the happy position of making things up as it goes along. By its standards, that would be a rational and systematic approach to negotiation. No, Mr. Speaker, the 3 amigos, as referred to the member from Foyle, are somewhere in the English Channel without a tiller or an oar between them. They're drifting. And the only problem with this is that it's not they who are paying the price for their incompetence. Quite. It's an incompetence dressed up as a need for confidentiality, or else the Germans or the French will be able to see our hand. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll let the government in on a secret. We don't have a hand to show anyone, including ourselves. We've had bluster, again from the Foreign Secretary, who's been ruminating across Europe, so he tells us. We have the Secretary of State for exiting Europe's misguided, nonchalant and insouciant attitude at the dispatch box, and it makes Sergeant Jones from Dad's Army look positively frenetic without the charm. Meanwhile, the International Trade Secretary, as the Right Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam said, he doesn't have a job and he doesn't appear to have realised yet. And I think this sums up the whole fiasco that is this government's position. On the 19th of July, I asked the Chief Secretary of the Treasury how many civil servants have been involved in planning, and he couldn't answer, and that's typical as well. Liverpool and Bootle, my constituency in the Wider Borough of Sefton, voted to remain in Europe, and I expect part of the reason for that is because because during the 1990s and the 1980s, the Tory government took a sledgehammer to the social and economic infrastructure of Merseyside, and the European Community was the only institution that continued to support my constituency. In fact, whilst we were being cut adrift by the Tories, with the odd honourable exception on the part of people such as Lord Heseltine, the European Community was the only substantial lifeline, both economically and socially, for my community. We looked to the EC for support, and we got it, and we didn't get it from the side opposite. And as a port with a long history of looking out to the world, we aren't afraid to meet and greet other nations. In fact, that is part of what makes us who we are, tolerant and outward-looking. We don't want to see that, and we don't want to see this lack of plan by the government halting the growth in the Merseyside economy, which is the second largest growth outside of London. And quite frankly, there's little in the statement from the Secretary of State for exiting Europe which gives me any confidence whatsoever that they will deliver anything for my city region. The government is silent on that aspect as on many other aspects, and it really is not good enough. The 3 Secretaries of State were vociferous in their demand to leave, but they are absolutely silent on what comes next.
It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Bootle. My parents hail from his constituency, and we are familiar as a family with both the devastation of the Merseyside economy and the role that the EU has played in supporting it over the years. I am glad to see the Government's engagement with this motion today. The lack of regard for Parliament in the Brexit process until now has been completely unacceptable and unjustifiable. 48% of people across the UK voted to remain in the EU. To put it another way, almost half. In my constituency, more than 3/4 of residents who voted to remain. And many who voted leave voted on the basis of promises which have subsequently proved at best to be hollow and at worst to be simply untrue. So while I respect the narrow result of the EU referendum, it cannot be considered for 1 second to be a mandate to negotiate Brexit on any terms the Prime Minister sees fit. The terms must be subject to full and proper parliamentary scrutiny, and the British people must, as a minimum, have the opportunity to voice through their elected representatives whether they consider that the emerging terms of negotiation are acceptable or not. In my constituency, there is huge alarm, and it is no exaggeration to say distress about Brexit. Young people whose lives could be fundamentally different as a consequence of Brexit, who didn't have the opportunity to vote, and who, if they had been able to vote as they should have been, may well have changed the decision, feel particularly aggrieved. I met with a group of students in my constituency last week whose anger and sense of disenfranchisement was palpable. EU nationals living in my constituency, many of whom work in our public services, feel bereft. I've spoken to many who say that although they have been in the UK for many years, this is the first time they have ever felt unwelcome and unwanted in the community they consider to be home. The business community in my constituency, 3,500 small and medium-sized enterprises, tell me that they feel the government simply does not understand the potential impacts of Brexit on small businesses. Small developers in my constituency, who we desperately need to deliver more homes, are putting schemes on hold because of the uncertainty. My local NHS trust is under very severe financial pressure, dependent on a workforce, many of whom come from overseas, who work hard to serve our community, who feel frankly insulted by some of the rhetoric the government has put out about foreign workers. My NHS workers would like to know whether and when our local trust will get a share of the £350 million a week which was promised, and when the government will be clear that they are valued for the contribution they make to treating and caring for sick patients, irrespective of where they come from. Mr Speaker, I am pleased that the Government appears to have recognised the need for parliamentary scrutiny in the Brexit negotiations. They must be clear that this will include a vote. And we must be clear. What will be the approach to the single market? How will the Government manage the risk to sterling? What will replace the European arrest warrant? What will be the impact of limitations on freedom of movement for the NHS and other critical services? What will be the status of British citizens living in the EU? How will workers' rights be protected? What will be the impact on our universities and on our students on scientific and medical research? And how will the Government mitigate these impacts? What will be done to ensure the loss of subsidy and investment is mitigated across the country? These things and many more were not the subject of the EU referendum question, but the consequences of the decisions that are made on them will be profound and will echo across generations to come. They are of the utmost importance to my constituents, and it is the responsibility of all of us in this House to play a full role in holding the Government to account.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The EU referendum laid bare two truths about British society. The first is that we are a divided country, with deep fissures running between communities and regions on a range of issues, from economic inequality and control of the UK's borders to the very nature of Britain and our place in the world. The second truth is that there is a destructive and almost complete lack of trust in our politics across large parts of our country. These two truths severely detract from our ability to make a success of Brexit. So we must now act decisively and quickly to rebuild trust in our politics and to heal the fractures within our society. The government's approach to the Brexit process must therefore have this necessity at its core, recognising that trust is built on openness and clarity. This is particularly important when the stakes for our country are so high, when the immense power that the Brexit process confers on this government will shape our society for generations to come. It is a sober responsibility, and to fulfil it, the government must be open and clear with the British people. From what we've seen so far, we can only assume that the government is steering us with a misplaced swagger and hubris towards the rocks of a harsh, intolerant Brexit. But no one can be sure. The government either doesn't want us to know what they're planning, or they simply don't know themselves. And moreover, given that the referendum gave no specific mandate for a negotiating position, the government must now be clear with the British people about what they intend for the future. The fact is that without parliamentary involvement, engagement and scrutiny, the only route to holding the executive to account will be through Whitehall whispers, Fleet Street filtering and disgruntled score settling. Mr. Speaker, after a referendum vote that was not, as the Prime Minister now seems to be suggesting, completely one-sided, but actually quite evenly balanced, we must find a path to Brexit that is driven by the national interest, rather than by the Prime Minister's need to manage the warring factions in her party. And that path must run through Parliament, which should have full legislative and scrutiny powers. This is not a ploy to void the result of the referendum. It is a vital action to meet the referendum's central demand that the UK take back control through a fully sovereign Parliament. We on these benches have absolutely no desire to see the result of the referendum overturned. It must stand. We on these benches are simply here to articulate the interests of the people we were elected to represent. Our responsibility is to secure the best possible deal for our country and our communities, whether it's steel trade defence instruments or replacing EU regional investment funding and beyond. Mr. Speaker, leadership is about building consensus and taking people with you. The Prime Minister should trust that Parliament is up to the task of playing a sober and constructive role at this decisive time for our country. The Prime Minister must now act to restore the people's faith in our parliamentary democracy by setting out how the Brexit process and subsequent withdrawal will work, and how both will be subject to the full scrutiny of Parliament every step of the way. For it is only improving that we in this place can work together to make success of Brexit, that we can rebuild trust in our politics and heal our fractured and divided society.
Christina Rees.
Mr. Speaker, much has been said of the extent of the economic impact of leaving the EU, as well as the impact in terms of social, political and cultural effects. There are questions to be answered on criminal justice, homeland security, border control, data sharing and environmental law. And members of this House have already spoken on these subjects, so I'm going to speak about regional funding. For my Neath constituency, it will be a defining issue of any Brexit deal. I'm very proud of the EU investment that has been made in West Wales and the valleys, but less proud of the fact that this money has been needed because we are one of the poorest regions in Europe, and I am fearful of the time when this money no longer exists. When I visit communities across my constituency and the wider region, I find vibrancy, tenacity, despite the hardship and economic decline. EU funding has brought community infrastructure, training, apprenticeships, regeneration, and there is no doubt that these structural funds have played a central role in the rebirth of the valleys. The decline of the mining industry ripped away the economic foundations of my constituency, and thousands of people found themselves unemployed. But visit Neath today, and you will see businesses starting up, new shops, a £13 million town centre redevelopment in progress. The economy of Neath and its villages is growing, and this growth is down to the effective investment of European funds secured by our wonderful Labour MEP Derek Vaughan. The last round of funding launched 485 businesses, supported 7,300 people into work, created 1,355 jobs, 14,870 qualifications have been gained, and close to 5,000 people have completed an EU-funded apprenticeship. Neath Talbot has been lead partner on Workways, a project delivered across the county borough and then extended throughout the West Wales region as its success was proved. This project has helped tackle barriers that prevented individuals from finding or returning to employment, thanks to 16.7 million of EU funding. Swansea Bay campus has had a beneficial impact on Neath and the region, and would not have happened without the 95 million European funding. No one knows the process that will follow Article 50 and the fate of projects during this period, let alone beyond the 2-year time frame. Already the Welsh Government has reprogrammed existing funding. Yesterday it announced that Communities First, the Welsh Government's flagship tackling poverty programme, will be cut in order to reinvest the money in projects that would have previously relied on EU funding. If parliamentary sovereignty is paramount, surely Parliament should have a say with negotiations, the process, the deal on exiting the EU, and needs full scrutiny. This government needs to be held to account. The national parliaments of EU member states will demand a say in ratifying Britain's exit, and it is only right that this House be involved in ameliorating the effects of unravelling a 40-year relationship and the work it will take to establish new trade deals. What will this government do to protect the 100,000 jobs in Wales that depend on trade with Europe? And thousands of people in my Neath constituency have found work through the support of the European Union. Thank you.
Mr. Barry Gardner.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And for the avoidance of doubt, we accept the government amendment. Mr. Speaker, today has been one of the finest debates in this House that I can remember. The contributions from honourable members have been like a Baedeker guide of the United Kingdom. Rushcliffe, Broxtowe, Beaconsfield, Doncaster North, Leeds Central, Loughborough, Wolverhampton North East, Wallasey, Birmingham Erdington, North East Bedfordshire, Wolverhampton South East, Basingstoke, Beaconsfield, East Ham, Newham, Foyle, Bishop Auckland, all absolutely superb speeches. And I have to also pay respect to those speeches made on the other side, Stone, Wokingham, North East Somersetshire and Spelthorne, who I thought were particularly worthy of note. It's right that this debate has taken place, and it was good that the government acceded to the will of Parliament by accepting the right of this House, indeed its duty, to properly scrutinise the government's proposals for leaving the EU before Article 50 is invoked. After the Prime Minister herself had insisted that the referendum was about this country taking back sovereign control over its own affairs, it would indeed have been difficult for her government to maintain that this sovereign parliament had no such right to scrutinise and express its will in relation to the biggest constitutional challenge that our country has faced in a generation. So I genuinely welcome the government's concession on this matter. What today's debate has made clear is that whichever way members of this chamber may have voted in the referendum, whether leave or remain, the vast majority of honourable and right honourable members do not wish to overturn the referendum vote. We are democrats, and however small the margin of victory, a 52 to 48% vote for leave is a majority. It represents a mandate, and it must be respected. Let us be equally clear, though, that just as the 17 million votes cast for leave must be respected, this did not mean that the rights and concerns of the 16 million people who voted to remain could be trampled upon. And whilst we of course accept that no government should give a running commentary on the details of its negotiation, what any responsible government must do is give a coherent and reasoned picture of what sort of future it aims to achieve for its citizens. What business leaders are demanding is not certainty, it is clarity. Everyone accepts that negotiations will be tough and protracted, and this means an inevitable period of uncertainty. But this should not stop the government from being clear in its purpose and its objectives. Our respect for our constituents must surely insist that they have a right to know what our future relationship with the EU might look like. After all, it is their jobs, their welfare, their livelihoods at stake. It is the future of their children and their grandchildren. What we're asking for is clarity on the terms of the UK leaving the EU. No, I will not, because Parliament has a duty to ensure that the various final options are considered accordingly and not simply forced through. Because Parliament has an obligation to ensure that each of them is properly debated and clearly presented to the British people. Every member of this House appreciates that each of the different possible outcomes of our leaving the EU has both advantages and downsides, and it would be morally repugnant, therefore, for anyone to pretend that there is only one sort of Brexit. That would be a lie. It would be to perpetrate a deception on the British people. The debate of June has moved on. We can no longer debate whether we leave the EU, but we absolutely must debate how we leave the EU. The government itself is clearly experiencing certain strains between its Treasury wing and its Brexit triumvirate. But it's not my purpose to make political hay with that dispute. In fact, I believe it is right that the government is having a serious debate and considering the various options. Our point is simply this, that it is not a discussion the government can keep to itself. Parliament must be part of that discussion, and the British public have a right to their say. Our role as politicians, as leaders of our different communities, is to present all these different possible options for how to leave the EU to our constituents and let them inform the final decision that this sovereign Parliament must make. Because our sovereignty rests on the sovereignty of the people. It's important, too, that we also understand, though, the limits of that sovereignty. It is said politicians propose, markets dispose. Sovereignty does not give you control over the confidence that others have in the strength of your currency. It was not for no reason that the Bank of England put £70 billion of extra liquidity into the UK economy immediately after the referendum result and lowered interest rates by a quarter point. Some commentators who are fond of reminding us that after the Brexit vote the sky did not fall in should perhaps consider that Mark Carney and the Monetary Policy Committee were pumping liquidity into the system precisely to prop it up. And sovereignty certainly does not give you control over the markets. And we have seen all too clearly in the past week the market's violent reaction when they thought that the government was proposing to leave both the single market and the customs union. And today, the pound stands at a 168-year low. So government can insist, it can exercise the royal prerogative and decide to withdraw from the preferential terms of access to the world's largest consumer market that the UK currently enjoys. But they are mistaken. They are very much mistaken if they confuse that exercise of sovereignty with any real control over the investment decision that companies will then take about the future of jobs and wages of our constituents. And if the market is right to have devalued the UK's stock so significantly, if the market is right in thinking that investors will no longer invest and that the UK's economic prospects have declined, then we need to understand that our current account deficit, which currently runs at £28.7 billion and which the fiscal rule was supposed to abolish before it was abolished itself, that deficit is only likely to widen. And the government has a responsibility to set out precisely how it proposes to deal with that economic fact. Because again, this is about the jobs, the wages, and the well-being of our constituents. As the Chancellor himself said, the British people did not vote to become poorer or less secure. But we must be open with the electorate that the prize of regaining full sovereignty is that we no longer will have any control over the regulation and standards in a market with which we currently have 44% of our exports and 53% of our imports. We must be open with the electorate that the control of movement of people from the EU that the Prime Minister spoke of at PNQs earlier today will also affect the capacity of companies to hire the skills they need to grow and prosper and employ more people here in the UK. Mr. Speaker, I am not in the habit of quoting the Daily Mail. I often like neither what they say nor the way in which they say it. But none of us should ignore what they say today. In an otherwise misleading and confused editorial, they say, what the public voted for was simple: to regain control of our borders in order to end mass immigration, reclaim control of our laws, and stop sending billions of pounds to Brussels. None of this is possible inside the single market, which requires the free movement of people. End of quote. If the government believes this, and I believe they do, the question must be asked why they will not admit that they have ruled out maintaining the access we currently enjoy to the single market. Immigration is the political heart of the Brexit debate, and we in the Labour Party state unequivocally that those EU workers currently here in the UK contributing to our economy must be allowed to stay, just as the 1.2 million UK citizens living and working in the rest of the EU must be also. We in the Labour Party here today also put on record that the principle of free movement of workers must be changed, and our new relationship with the EU must put in place clear and fair immigration controls that work to the benefit of the British people. But there will be a cost in terms of market access, in terms of investment, in terms of jobs, in terms of our constituents' livelihood. Why is the government afraid to say so? The answer is because they do not want to admit the financial consequences that must inevitably follow from such an admission. The free traders are actually fighting against the financial consequences of leaving the largest free trade market in the world. The government has 170 days. The Secretary of State can continue to duck and dive as he did today, 42 minutes in which he said nothing. But democracy demands that the government should publish the terms of Brexit and submit them to the scrutiny of this sovereign parliament. And the people of Britain will not trust this government until they do.
I call on Minister David Jones to reply to the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I join with the honourable member for Brent North in congratulating all the honourable members who contributed to this excellent debate today about what the motion rightly describes as the defining issue facing the United Kingdom. We agree that it is entirely proper that Parliament should scrutinise the government's approach to the process of leaving the European Union, and that there should be full and continuing debate on that process. It is beyond doubt, Mr. Speaker, and that was fully accepted by the Shadow Secretary of State and many other honourable members who contributed today, that the government has received clear instructions from the British people that Britain should leave. I will not give way because I have very little time. The referendum held on the 23rd of June was one of the biggest democratic exercises in British history. The turnout was high at 72%, with over 33 million people participating. Over 1 million more people voted to leave than to remain. The turnout was bigger than any general election vote since 1992. No single party or Prime Minister has achieved more votes in our history than did the vote to leave in June. This was, Mr. Speaker, a once-in-a-generation vote, and that decision must be respected. And now we all have a duty, as the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield said, as members of this House, to respect and not seek to frustrate the will of the people of the United Kingdom. And I am pleased to observe today that that is a proposition with which most honourable members who participated agreed. The government recognises that Parliament must play a full part in the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the EU, and it will, of course, observe in full all legal and constitutional requirements that apply during the course of withdrawal. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, said, we are committed to working with Parliament as we seek to obtain the best deal for Britain in that process of withdrawal. But let me be absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker. The triggering of the Article 50 procedure is a matter for royal prerogative. But we will take fully into account the views of all members in our parliamentary engagement, which has already, in the short life of my department, been extensive, and debates such as today's are part of the process whereby Parliament will hold the government to account. So far, Mr. Speaker, in the 2.5 working weeks since the summer recess, my right honourable friend has made 2 oral statements and appeared before 2 select committees. In his opening, he listed the parliamentary engagements that ministers from his department have attended and will be continuing to attend. And this government welcomes and encourages that participating. Because, Mr. Speaker, the restoration of parliamentary sovereignty is at the very core of why we are leaving the European Union. Once we have left, the primacy of the United Kingdom Parliament will no longer be in doubt, and that, as my honourable friend, the member for Stone, said, is why the Great Repeal Bill will be securing that outcome. And that bill, I have no doubt, I will not give way. That bill, I have no doubt, will be subjective to rigorous scrutiny by both Houses of Parliament during its passage. It will be for Parliament to determine what changes to the law best suit the national interest in that Great Repeal Bill. But the national interest must be the paramount consideration for both Government and Parliament. So we'll shortly be entering into extensive and detailed negotiations as to the terms of our withdrawal. And it's entirely right that the government should not damage its position in those negotiations by spelling out in fine detail what that negotiation is. I won't give way. Nobody sensible would expect that, least of all those with whom we will be negotiating. My right honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, has already set out the broad aims of our negotiation, which include, crucially, regaining control of our borders and having the most open access possible to the European market. But I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, that honourable members will understand the practical realities of our withdrawal negotiations. Indeed, the House of Lords EU Committee summarised what they considered to be the correct approach to parliamentary scrutiny when they said, "We acknowledge that certain elements of the forthcoming negotiations, particularly those relating to trade, may have to be conducted confidentially. We would expect parliamentary scrutiny of the negotiations to strike an appropriate balance between transparency and confidentiality while achieving the overarching objective of holding the government effectively to account." I'll give way to the honourable gentleman from Wrexham.
I'm most grateful to the right honourable gentleman from North Wales, and I'm going to put to him the question I put to the Secretary of State earlier on, namely, if he believes in parliamentary sovereignty, will the government please present to Parliament its opening position for scrutiny and votes before it begins to conduct negotiations? Will he give the Chamber that assurance?
The House will, of course, be fully engaged as matters progress. But I have to repeat to the honourable gentleman, and by the way, I remind him that I've been more generous in giving way than his colleague from Brent North was. He will have to understand the element of confidentiality in the negotiations that was quite rightly identified by the House of Lords EU Committee. So we fully agree that that balance will have to be struck, which is why we do seek to amend the motion today. We agree that there should be a transparent debate on the government's plans for leaving the EU, and that there should be proper... I will not give way further. But that process should also respect the decision of the British people to leave the EU and should not adversely affect our negotiating position. That, we believe, is the sensible position to adopt, and one, I believe, that would receive the approval of most sensible people in this country. We don't propose to veil our preparations for negotiation in secrecy, but at the same time, we want to serve the national interest, and that means going about the negotiations in a practical and sensible manner. Now, one theme developed during the course of today's debate, and that was raised by a number of right honourable members, including the right honourable member for East Ham, the honourable members for Stafford, Dudley South, Wrexham, and that was the issue of membership of the single market and freedom of movement. And let me say that the government's position is this. While the ability to trade with EU member states is clearly vital to our prosperity, there is at the same time clearly no mandate for a deal that involves accepting the existing arrangements governing free movement of people from the European Union. But we don't accept, Mr. Speaker, that this is a binary trade-off in terms of border control on the one hand and access to the single market for goods and services on the other. We are aiming for the best deal for both for Britain, and that is what I believe all honourable members should be striving for. I wish, Mr. Speaker, to reiterate my thanks and the thanks of the honourable member for Brent North to all the honourable members who have participated in today's debate. There have been a number of excellent contributions from a large number of right honourable and honourable members. And another theme that developed, and I think that it was very heartening during the course of the debate, is to understand that the referendum is over, it has been completed, that we all have to accept the result, and we need to move on together as a House in the national interest. This was a point that I felt that was most clearly expressed by my honourable friend, my right honourable friend for South East Bedfordshire. So, Mr. Speaker, we will be giving full consideration to all the points that have been so clearly raised by so many honourable and right honourable members today. And no doubt further points that will similarly be raised in the weeks and the months to come. So we are happy to accept the opposition's motion, which I believe was a helpful motion and which has been the catalyst for an excellent debate today, which has developed the argument significantly, subject to the addition of the words contained in the government's amendment. Mr. Speaker, this country is now standing on the threshold of a new chapter in its history and a new relationship with the continuing members of the European Union. Every single member of this House, I know, will want our withdrawal to be a success for the national interest. And I believe that the amendment is entirely proper, and I commend it to the House.
Order. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is the main motion as amended. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.